Yo, what's up everyone? It's Goofy Harry and today we're checking out what if Jon Arryn left Jon Snow the evidence that could destroy Robert's reign. Drop a like if you're hyped. Subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1. The Hand's last gift. The Maester's tower smelled of tallow and dust, and Jon Arryn had learned to hate that smell in the last month of his life, because it meant he was awake in the dark again, unable to sleep, going through papers that should have been burned years ago. He sat at the narrow table by candlelight with 3 books open before him, old, water-stained things from the Citadel that no one had asked for in a generation, and a stack of letters tied with ribbon that had once been red and was now the color of dried blood. His hands did not shake, not yet, though his stomach had been sour for 3 days, and there was a taste in his mouth like pennies that would not go away no matter how much wine he drank to wash it out. He was 60 years old, and he had served 2 kings, and he understood now, with the particular clarity that comes only when a man suspects he is dying, that he had spent the last 20 years of his life protecting a lie he hadn't known he was protecting. The book in front of him was a genealogical record of House Baratheon, copied out by some Citadel Maester 3 generations back, listing the coloring and features that ran true in Robert's line going back to the Age of Heroes. Black hair, blue eyes so dark they were near violet in some lights, strong jaws, heavy brows, a build that ran to thickness even in youth. He had read the passage 4 times now, and each time his eye went to the same line. The seed is strong in House Baratheon, and it does not lie, and each time his stomach turned over. He thought of Joffrey's golden curls. He thought of Miacella's green eyes, bright as her mother's. He thought of Tommen, soft and round-faced and nothing like the man who called himself their father. He had asked himself for weeks why it had never occurred to him before, and the answer, when it came, was almost too simple to bear, because he had not wanted it to occur to him. He had known Robert since they were boys together in the Vale, had fought beside him in a war that broke a dynasty, had held his friend's crown steady through 15 years of drink and grief and neglect. To suspect Cersei Lannister of what he now suspected was to admit that everything he had built his loyalty around, the throne, the peace, the children who would inherit it, was built on air. But he had asked. Quietly, carefully, the way he asked everything, because that was his nature, not a man who leapt, but a man who walked, slowly, checking each stone before he put his weight on it. He had asked Grand Maester Pycelle, offhand, about bastardy in noble houses, about how the blood ran true or didn't. He had gone to the brothels near Fleabottom, not for the reason men assumed when they saw the hand of the king slipping in a side door at dusk, but to find a girl named Barra, whom people said had been sired by Robert during one of his rare, careless nights with a working woman. And he had found her, and looked at her, and seen Robert's face staring back at him from a child's frame, black-haired and blue-eyed and unmistakable. Then he had gone home and looked at Cersei's children again, and the wrongness of it had settled into his bones like a fever. He had confronted Robert's cupbearer first, a small, nervous man named Lancel Lannister, the Queen's own cousin, who flinched when Jon Arryn asked him plainly whether he'd been putting anything extra in the king's wine on the Queen's instruction. Lancel had not answered. He had gone pale and mumbled something about duty and left the room too quickly, and that alone had told Jon Arryn more than any confession could have. 3 days after that, his stomach had begun to burn. He knew now, sitting alone with his candle and his books, that he had perhaps a week left, if that. He knew because he had seen this particular poison work before, slow and merciless, eating a man from the inside while leaving no mark anyone would think to look for. He knew because whoever had done this to him had done it carefully, and carefully was a word that belonged to only one woman in this castle. He should have been afraid. He found instead that he was calm, colder and clearer than he had been in years, the way a man's mind sometimes sharpens right before it's taken from him. He thought about Robert, who would grieve him and then forget him within a fortnight, buried under wine and whores, and the business of ruling a kingdom he'd never wanted to rule. He thought of his own son, 6 years old, sickly, who would inherit the Vale far too young. He thought of Lysa, his wife, whom he had never fully trusted and trusted even less now. And he thought of Ned Stark. He had wanted, in the first days of understanding what he'd found, to send word north immediately. "Ned, come to King's Landing. I need you. There is a rot here that only you would believe me about." But he had held that thought and turned it over and set it down again, because he knew his friend too well. Ned would come. Ned would come riding hard and righteous, and Ned would walk straight into King's Landing with his honor on his sleeve like a target. And Cersei Lannister, because by now Jon Arryn was certain, in the marrow-deep way a man is certain of things he cannot yet prove, would have him killed within the month, the same way she had killed Jon Arryn himself, slow and quiet and never once dirtying her own hands. If he sent for Ned, he would be sending his oldest friend to his death, armed with nothing but suspicion, and a stack of documents Cersei's people would burn the moment they searched Jon Arryn's rooms, which they would, the instant he was in the ground. He needed somewhere to put the truth that Cersei Lannister could not reach, somewhere beyond gold, beyond spies, beyond the reach of a queen's fear. He had thought of the Citadel first, but Maesters gossiped in their chains the same as anyone, and half of them owed their positions to houses that would sell the truth to the highest bidder before the ink dried. He had thought of the Iron Bank, absurdly, for half a night, before dismissing it as madness. He had thought, finally, of the Wall. No one went to the Wall who didn't have to. No spies bothered with it. No lords cared what happened there. No queen's agents lingered in that cold for information no one at court thought mattered. It was the one place in the 7 kingdoms that had fallen entirely outside the game, a fortress made of forgotten men, holding a border everyone assumed was decorative. And there was a boy there. Ned's boy. Not his heir, not his son by name or by law, but blood all the same. Raised at Winterfell with Ned's own honesty stitched into him the way Jon Arryn had seen it stitched into every Stark he'd ever known. A boy with no ambition anyone would suspect, no claim anyone would fear, no reason for Cersei's spies to ever look twice at him. Jon Arryn had met him only twice. Once as an infant Ned had brought south for a tourney, wrapped in furs and silent, dark-eyed even then. And once as a boy of perhaps 12, quiet and watchful at his father's side during a visit north that Jon Arryn had made years back on some now-forgotten matter of border wardens. He remembered the boy's eyes most of all gray, like Ned's, but with something else behind them, a stillness that made him seem older than his years, the way some children are simply born watching rather than reacting. He did not know the boy. But he knew Ned Stark, and he knew that whatever Ned had raised, it would not be a boy who ran from the truth, or sold it, or buried it out of fear. So on the evening of the 4th day after his stomach began to burn in earnest, Jon Arryn called for his most trusted steward, an old man named Varys Edgen who had served the Arryns for 30 years and asked no questions he wasn't paid to ask, and gave him a locked chest, small enough to fit in a saddlebag, and a letter sealed 3 times over. "This does not go by Raven," Jon Arryn told him, and his voice was steady even though his hands, finally, had begun to shake. "This goes by Ryder, a man you trust with your life, Varys, because it will be his life if he's caught with it. He rides for the Wall, not Winterfell. The Wall itself, Castle Black. He asks for a boy there named Jon Snow, Lord Eddard Stark's bastard son, and no one else. Not the Lord Commander, not any Maester, not any officer of the Watch. Jon Snow, and only Jon Snow." Varys Edgen, to his credit, did not ask why. He had served long enough to know that some questions cost more than they were worth. "It will be done, my lord. Tell the rider to say nothing of who sent it if he can help it. If he's stopped, if anyone asks, he carries a debt payment to a watch officer, nothing more. A gambling debt, something dull enough that no one troubles to look closer." Jon Arryn's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. Men trouble themselves over gold and treason. They rarely trouble themselves over an old debt owed to the night's watch. No one there has anything worth stealing. "And if the boy asks who sent it, my lord." Jon Arryn was quiet a moment. Outside, somewhere in the Red Keep's endless stone corridors, a bell was ringing for the evening meal, ordinary and distant, a sound from a world that no longer quite included him. "Tell him it comes from a man who loved his father and who trusts him because of it," he said finally. "Tell him that's all the explanation he'll get, because I may not live long enough to give him more." Vardy's Edgen's face did something complicated then, grief, maybe, or fear, or simple bewilderment, but he only bowed and took the chest. And by midnight a rider named Corliss Penny was 3 miles outside King's Landing's walls, riding north on the King's Road with a locked box strapped beneath his saddle and no idea at all what he carried. Jon Arryn did not live to see whether the rider made it. 6 days later, on a morning bright with fall spring sunlight, he collapsed in the Red Keep's godswood, blood at his mouth, and died before Grand Maester Pycelle's men could carry him back to his chambers. Robert wept over him like a brother, which he was, in every way that had ever mattered. Cersei Lannister stood at the back of the small crowd that gathered, her face composed into exactly the correct measure of solemn grief, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. 500 miles north, the wind off the wall was already turning bitter with the last edges of winter's grip, though the calendar called it spring, and Jon Snow was on his back in the mud of the training yard with Gren's boot pressing down hard on his chest, and Alistair Thorne's voice cutting through the cold air like a whip. "Dead," Thorne said, not without a certain satisfaction. "You're dead, Lord Snow. The wildlings put 6 inches of steel through your belly while you were busy admiring your own footwork." Jon shoved Gren off him, not hard. Gren was a friend mostly these days. In the strange fashion the yard produced friendships out of men who'd spent a month trying to beat each other senseless, and got to his feet, breathing hard, wiping mud from his jaw. His ribs ached where Gren's practice sword had caught him a moment before the takedown. He'd feel that in the morning. "He telegraphed the strike," Jon said. "Big man like that shifts his weight before he swings. You watch the hips, not the blade." "Is that so?" Thorne's voice had gone soft and dangerous, the tone he used right before he made an example of someone. "And yet here you are, on your back, telling me about hips." "I was watching the hips," Jon said. "I still lost." Something in the flatness of that answer, no excuse offered, no wounded pride, just fact, made a few of the other recruits laugh, quickly stifled. Pip, near the fence, grinned outright before catching Thorne's glare and wiping the grin off his face like he was scrubbing a plate. Thorne studied Jon for a long moment, the kind of look he gave when he was deciding whether to escalate or let something pass. 3 months ago, that look would have ended in Jon on the ground twice more before the lesson was done. Some petty cruelty about bastard blood dressed up as instruction. But 3 months ago Jon had also been the boy who lost his temper, who rose to every bait Thorne threw at him about Winterfell and Lady Stark, and where exactly he fit in his father's house. He didn't rise any more. He'd learned, slowly and at some cost, that the surest way to blunt Thorne's knife was to simply refuse to bleed for him. Again, Thorne said instead, turning away, "Gren, this time don't let him talk his way out of a beating with clever words about hips." They went again, and this time Jon watched the hips, and when Gren's weight shifted he was already moving, sidestepping, bringing the flat of his blunted blade down across Gren's forearm hard enough to make the bigger boy yelp and drop his sword. "Better," Thorne said, in a voice that made the word sound like an insult. but he moved on to torment someone else, and that was, in its way, a kind of victory. Afterward, in the armory, Jon sat on a bench working oil into the leather grip of his own sword, not a practiced blade, a plain thing he'd bought off a retiring ranger with coins scraped together over 2 years. While Samwell Tarly fussed with a stack of books he'd somehow convinced the steward to let him carry from the library without proper authorization. "You're going to get caught with those," Jon said, not looking up. "I have authorization," Sam said primly. "Meister Eamon asked me to catalog the older texts. It's practically the same thing." "It is not remotely the same thing." "Well, it should be." Sam sat down heavily beside him, the bench groaning under his weight, and immediately opened one of the books, a heavy thing bound in cracked black leather that looked like it predated the Targaryens. "Did you see Gren's face when you took his arm out? I thought he was going to cry." "He didn't cry. He looked like he wanted to." Sam turned a page, squinting in the dim light. "You've gotten fast, Jon. Faster than 3 months ago, certainly." "I've had good reason to get faster." Jon finally looked up, and something in his face made Sam pause. "Thorne's not going to stop testing me until I either break or he gets bored. I'd rather not break." Sam had no answer to that because there wasn't a good one, and the two of them sat in a companionable silence for a while, Jon working oil into leather, Sam mouthing words to himself as he read, until the sound of boots on stone announced someone else's arrival, Pip, breathless, ducking under the low doorway. "Snow," he said, "there's a man asking for you at the gate. A rider. Says he's come from King's Landing itself." Jon set down the sword. "For me?" "That's what he's saying." "Bowen Marsh's got him waiting. Wants to know if you're actually expecting anyone. Because apparently the man won't hand over whatever he's carrying to anyone but you by name, and that's making people nervous." It should have made Jon nervous too, and in some distant way it did. Nobody rode from the capital to Castle Black for a bastard boy of the Night's Watch, not for any good reason he could think of. But there was also a strange, quiet certainty settling in his chest, the kind that came sometimes before he understood why. He'd learned over the years to trust that feeling, even when he couldn't yet explain it. "I'll go," he said, and left the sword unfinished on the bench. The rider was younger than Jon expected, road-worn, his cloak crusted with mud that had dried and cracked in patterns showing weeks, not days, of hard travel. He stood near the gate under the watchful eye of Bowen Marsh, the Lord Steward, who had the particular pinched expression he wore whenever something happened at Castle Black that hadn't been scheduled and accounted for in advance. "You're Jon Snow?" the rider asked, before anyone else could speak. "I am. Lord Eddard Stark's son. His bastard, yes." Jon said it flatly, the way he'd learned to, robbing the word of whatever weapon it might otherwise be for a stranger to use. The rider, he gave his name as Corliss Penny, though something in the careful, rehearsed way he said it made Jon wonder if it was true, reached into a saddlebag and pulled free a small chest, iron-banded, no larger than a strongbox for a modest merchant's coin. He held it out, and Jon took it without thinking, surprised by the weight of it more than a chest that size should hold. "I was told to give this to you and no one else," Corliss said. "Not the Lord Commander, not any Meister. You and only you." Bowen Marsh made a sound of displeased surprise. "That's highly irregular. Anything entering this castle is subject to—" "With respect, sir," Corliss said, "I was told to say that the man who sent this served a hand of the king for 30 years, and knew exactly how irregular this would seem, and sent it anyway because he trusted the boy more than he trusted the customs." He looked at Jon directly then, and something in his weathered, exhausted face softened, just slightly. "He said to tell you this comes from a man who loved your father. That's all the words I was given. He said he might not live long enough to give you more." The yard had gone quiet around them, a few recruits drifting close to listen, Sam hovering near the gatehouse door, even Bowen Marsh's irritation fading into something more watchful. Jon felt the weight of the chest in his hands like it had doubled in the space of that sentence. "Who sent this?" he asked, though some part of him, the part that had already begun doing the arithmetic of hand of the king, 30 years, loved your father, already suspected. I wasn't given the name, my lord. Only the message. Corlys hesitated, then added, quieter, as if it cost him something to say, but I rode from King's Landing, and before I left, the man who gave me this box was pale as a corpse and looked like he already knew he was dying. If I had to guess, and no one asked me to guess, so this is only mine to say, I'd guess it was Lord Arryn himself. The hand. Jon Arryn. Robert's hand. The man his father had served with in the war that made the 7 kingdoms what they were. The man who'd once come north and spoken to Jon with a strange, careful courtesy that Jon at 12 had found bewildering. Most lords didn't bother being courteous to bastards. Is he? Jon started, and didn't finish the question, because he already knew somehow. The way you know a storm has broken even before the first drop of rain reaches you. I don't know, my lord. I left before I heard anything more. I rode as fast as the roads and my horse would allow, because whatever's in that box, the man who sent it seemed to think it mattered a great deal that it reach you and reach you quickly. Jon looked down at the chest in his hands. Small, plain, iron-banded, entirely unremarkable. The kind of thing a man might carry a modest inheritance in, or letters of no particular importance, or nothing at all worth the weeks this rider had clearly spent in the saddle to deliver it. Thank you, he said to Corlys, meaning it more than the simple words could carry. You should eat and rest. Whatever else this is, you've earned that much. Bowen Marsh, to his credit, did not press the matter further, though the look on his face said clearly enough that he intended to raise it with the Lord Commander before the day was out. Jon didn't blame him. He carried the chest to his own small cell off the barracks, Sam trailing after him with the particular anxious energy of a man who very badly wants to be included in whatever is about to happen and doesn't quite know how to ask. You're not going to open that in the yard, Sam observed unnecessarily as Jon set the chest on his narrow bed and studied the lock. Number, do you want me to fetch a key, or I don't have a key. I don't know what this is. Jon ran his thumb along the iron banding the seams. Well made, but not impossibly so. A determined man with the right tools could break it open in a few minutes' work. He thought of Jon Arryn's face, the 2 brief times he'd met him. A careful man. A man who chose his words with the same precision he clearly chose his locks. 3 seals on the letter, hidden delivery. A writer given only half the truth. Everything about this said the same thing, over and over. Whatever is inside this box, someone believed it was dangerous enough to kill for. Jon, Sam's voice had dropped, gone serious in a way it rarely did. If the hand of the king sent you something and died right after, that's not nothing. That's not a debt or an inheritance. I know what it might be. Jon didn't look up. That's why I need to see what it is before I decide who else needs to know. He found a small iron bar among his gear, meant for prying frozen boots free of ice of all things, and worked it into the seam of the lock, patient, methodical, the way his father had taught him to approach anything mechanical that resisted. Don't force it, find where it wants to give. It took nearly 10 minutes, and by the end his knuckles were scraped raw, but the lock finally gave with a small, defeated click, and the lid came free. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to keep the damp out, was a stack of papers thicker than Jon had expected, along with a single sealed letter sitting on top, his name written across it in a hand that was educated, precise, and slightly unsteady, as though whoever wrote it had been fighting some tremor in their fingers. Jon broke the seal. Jon Snow, if this letter finds you, I am likely already dead, or close enough to it that the distinction hardly matters. I write this knowing I may never see whether it reaches you, and knowing that if it does, I am asking something monstrous of a boy I have met only twice in his life. For that I am sorry, and I hope you will forgive an old man his desperation. I have served House Baratheon as Hand of the King for 15 years. In that time, I have buried a great many things that were easier left buried, because a kingdom's peace is often built on convenient silences, and I told myself that was wisdom rather than cowardice. I no longer believe that. What I have found cannot be buried, because it touches the succession of the Iron Throne itself, and I have come to believe, too late, and at too great a cost, that the woman who shares Robert's throne has been deceiving him for the whole of their marriage, and that her children, who will one day rule the 7 kingdoms, are not his. I have proof, not rumor, not suspicion, proof, gathered carefully over the last month, that I have enclosed with this letter. A physical record of House Baratheon's true-born coloring across 4 generations, which the Queen's children do not share. A written account from a Citadel Meister regarding the impossibility of certain bloodlines producing certain traits. A confession, taken under oath before a septon, from a serving girl who attended the Queen in her confinements and observed things she was paid, and later threatened, into silence about, and letters, private letters, taken at some risk from where they were hidden, that I will let speak for themselves, because I have not the strength left to summarize what they say without my hand shaking too badly to write. I confronted, carefully, a member of the Queen's own household about what I suspected. Within days, I began to sicken. I do not believe this is coincidence. I believe I am being killed, slowly and with great care, by people who understood that I was close enough to the truth to be dangerous. And I believe that whoever comes after me, whoever inherits my position, my papers, my house, will not be safe either, if they are seen to know what I know. I have not sent this to your father, though God knows I love him like a brother and trust him beyond any man living. I have not sent it because Ned Stark, if given this, would ride to King's Landing with his honor bared like a sword, and he would be dead within the season, because honor is no protection against poison and men do not see knives coming when they insist on believing the world is as honest as they are. I love him too much to hand him a death sentence dressed as the truth. I send it to you instead because you are his blood, and because I believe, I hope, that a boy raised at the edge of the world, trained to watch the dark for threats no one else believes in, might have learned something your father never had to learn: patience with danger, and the wisdom to wait before you strike. I am asking you to hold what I could not hold. I am asking you to be wiser with this than I was, and to use it only when using it will do more good than harm, to protect your family, to protect the realm, and if the day comes when it must be spoken aloud, to speak it in a way that ends the lie rather than simply ending you. I do not know what kind of man you have grown into. I met a boy who watched more than he spoke, and I choose to believe that boy has become someone worthy of this burden. If I am wrong, then I have doomed us all, and there is nothing more I can do about it now but hope. Trust no one at court who has not proven themselves to you first, not even those who claim friendship. Trust the Meister at your wall, if he is the man his reputation says he is. Old blood remembers old truths, and there are few men left alive who remember as much as he does. And when the time comes, if it comes, send word to your father before you send word to anyone else, because whatever else is true, he deserves to know before the rest of the world does. Gods keep you, Jon Snow. I am sorry to have made you part of this. I do not know what else was left for me to do. Jon Arryn. The letter shook slightly in Jon's hands by the time he reached the end of it, though whether from the cold of the cell or something else entirely, he couldn't have said. Sam had gone very quiet beside him, watching Jon's face rather than the letter, reading the news off his expression before Jon said a single word aloud. "Jon," Sam said finally, carefully. "What does it say?" Jon didn't answer immediately. He set the letter down and began going through the rest of the chest's contents, laying each piece out on his thin blanket with the same deliberate care he'd have used disarming a trap. The genealogical record, brittle with age, a folded testimony bearing a septon seal, and a shaky signature at the bottom that read Sarah. A bundle of letters tied with a ribbon that had once been some color richer than the faded pink it had become, and beneath all of it, a small portrait miniature of a golden-haired boy who might have been 8 or 9 years old, with green eyes that were nothing at all like Robert Baratheon's famous Baratheon blue. He read through the testimony first, because it was shortest and most direct, and by the time he finished it his jaw had gone tight enough to ache. He read the Meister's notes on bloodlines next, cross-checking them against the genealogical record without quite meaning to, the same instinct that made him double-check a knot or a snare before trusting his weight to it. Then he untied the ribbon on the letters and began to read those, and it was there, 20 minutes later, with the cell gone cold and dark around him, and Sam sitting frozen and silent on the edge of the bed, that Jon Snow finally understood the full and terrible shape of what had been placed in his hands. The letters were between Cersei Lannister and her brother Jaime. Not political letters, not the careful, coded correspondence of statecraft that a man might expect between a queen and her house's champion. These were something else entirely, intimate, unmistakable in their intent, written across years, referencing meetings, referencing children by name in a way that left absolutely no room for innocent interpretation. Jon had grown up around soldiers and grooms and men who spoke plainly about the business of men and women. He was not a boy who needed things spelled out twice. By the third letter he'd stopped needing to read further to know exactly what he was looking at, and he read the rest anyway, because Jon Arryn had trusted him to understand the whole of it, and understanding half would be its own kind of failure. "Jon," Sam's voice had gone thin. "Jon, what is it? You've gone white as a sheet." Jon sat very still for a long moment, the papers spread out before him in the dim light of a single tallow candle, and felt something settle in his chest that was not quite fear, and not quite fury, but some hard, cold combination of the two. A feeling he recognized dimly from the training yard. The moment right before you decide to stop defending and start attacking. "Sam," he said, quiet and level, "I need you to swear to me, on whatever you hold most sacred, that what I'm about to tell you does not leave this room. Not to Pip, not to Gren, not to anyone in this castle, not even to your father if he rode here himself and demanded it. Do you understand what I'm asking?" Sam's eyes had gone very wide, but to his credit, and Jon would remember this later, would remember it as the moment he first truly understood what kind of friend he'd found in this frightened, brilliant, unlikely boy, he didn't hesitate. "I swear it," Sam said. "On my mother's grave, Jon, I swear it." Jon looked down at the letters one more time, at Cersei Lannister's own hand condemning her, at the golden-haired boy in the portrait who would one day, if nothing changed, sit on the Iron Throne with a false claim and a crown that belonged to another man entirely. "Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King, is dead," he said. "And before he died he found proof that Queen Cersei's children aren't the king's. Not one of them. He sent it to me because he was afraid to send it to my father, afraid it would get him killed." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice had steadied into something Sam had never quite heard from him before, not the flat control he used to deflect thorns needling, but something with real weight behind it, real intent. "He was right to be afraid. I think whoever poisoned him is going to come for whoever they think might know what he knew. And I think, sooner or later, that's going to include my father, because Robert will want his oldest friend beside him again. And Ned Stark is exactly foolish enough, exactly honest enough, to walk into that pit without seeing the knives waiting in it." "Then we have to warn him," Sam said immediately. "Send a raven tonight before. Number John's answer came fast and certain, and something in it made Sam close his mouth. Not yet. A raven can be intercepted. A raven says my son knows something, and the moment anyone at court suspects that, everyone connected to me becomes a target, my father, my sisters, everyone at Winterfell. Jon Arryn didn't trust ravens with this. He sent it by a rider who didn't even know what he was carrying. I have to be at least that careful, or I'll get people killed faster than I save them. Then, what do we do? Jon was quiet for a long moment, looking at the papers spread across his blanket, the whole rotten architecture of a lie that had propped up a kingdom for 15 years, sitting now in the hands of a 19-year-old bastard at the edge of the known world, 500 miles from anyone who could use it, and 1,000 miles from anyone who would believe it without proof. He thought about Jon Arryn's letter, the wisdom to wait before you strike, and felt, for the first time since he'd taken his vows at the wall, something other than quiet resignation about his place in the world. He was not going to simply hold this and wait for it to be taken from him, the way he'd spent years quietly absorbing every small cruelty about his birth without ever fully pushing back. He had been handed a weapon that could reshape the 7 kingdoms, and Jon Arryn, a man who had known kings and wars and the true price of both, had trusted him, specifically, to know when and how to use it. He was not going to waste that trust by being afraid of it. First, Jon said slowly, we hide this properly, somewhere no one thinks to look, because if Bowen Marsh's suspicions reach the wrong ears, someone may come looking. Then I need to speak to Maester Aemon. Not because I need his permission, because Jon Arryn told me to trust him, and because if there's a man alive who understands what a secret like this can do to a realm before it's used properly, it's him. He's outlived 3 kings and buried enough truths of his own that he'll know things I don't. And after that, Jon folded Jon Arryn's letter carefully and set it, for the moment, closest to his own heart inside his jerkin against his chest, where it would stay until he found somewhere safer. After that, he said, we wait until we understand exactly what we're holding and exactly who we can trust with it, and then we use it. Not to hide, Sam, not to protect myself. He looked up, and there was nothing uncertain in his face at all, nothing of the bastard boy who'd spent years learning to make himself smaller so the world would leave him alone. Jon Arryn didn't send this 500 miles so I could bury it under my bed and pray no one ever asks me about it. He sent it because he believed I'd know what to do with it eventually. I intend to prove him right. Outside, the wind had picked up, hard and cold off the ice, rattling the shutters of the tower and carrying, faint and far off, the sound of the evening horn calling the watch to supper, an ordinary sound on an ordinary night, in a castle that had no idea it now held, in the hands of one of its youngest and least regarded members, the single most dangerous secret in the 7 kingdoms. Jon gathered the papers, wrapped them again in their oilcloth, and placed them back in the broken chest. He would find a better hiding place before morning, somewhere dry, somewhere private, somewhere even Bowen Marsh's careful eyes wouldn't think to search. Then he would go to Maester Aemon, quietly, alone, and begin the long, careful work of deciding exactly how a bastard boy at the edge of the world was going to bring down a queen without getting his family killed in the process. He did not feel afraid. That surprised him, some distant part of his mind noted, turning the feeling over like a stone he didn't quite recognize. He felt instead something closer to purpose. The same clean, focused certainty he felt in the training yard when he finally read an opponent's weight correctly and knew, before the strike even landed, exactly where to place his own. Somewhere south, in King's Landing, Robert Baratheon was weeping over his oldest friend's body, and Cersei Lannister was already beginning, carefully and without a single visible tremor of guilt, to search her dead enemy's chambers for anything he might have left behind. She would not find it. It was 500 miles north of her reach, in the hands of a boy she did not know existed, who had already decided he was not going to hide. Chapter 2. The old man who remembers Maester Aemon's chambers smelled of old parchment, and the particular mustiness of a room that had not seen fresh air in longer than most men in the castle, had been alive. Jon found him where he always was in the hour before dark, seated near the small brazier with his blind eyes turned toward the window, as though he could still see the last gray light fading over the ice. A raven perched motionless on the back of his chair like it had been carved there. "Jon Snow," the old man said, before Jon had spoken a word or made more than the faintest sound crossing the threshold. "You walk differently tonight." "Differently how, Maester?" "Heavier." Aemon's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "A man carrying something he hasn't decided whether to put down yet walks like that. I have heard that walk before in other men in another life." He gestured a small economical motion toward the stool near the brazier. "Sit. Tell me what's brought you, or don't, and let an old blind man guess instead. I find I still enjoy guessing, even now." Jon sat. He'd rehearsed. In the hour it had taken him to walk here after supper, where to hide the chest, what to say, how much to say, and found now that all of it had abandoned him the moment he was actually in the room. He looked at the old man's face, lined and gentle and utterly unreadable behind the milk-white ruin of his eyes, and thought of Jon Arryn's letter. "Trust the Maester at your wall, if he is the man his reputation says he is. Old blood remembers old truths, and there are few men left alive who remember as much as he does." "A rider came from King's Landing today," Jon said finally. "He brought a letter and a chest. From Jon Arryn, the hand of the king." Something changed in Aemon's face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of stillness, the settling of a man bracing for weight before it lands. "Jon Arryn is dead, Jon Snow. The raven came this morning before your rider, though it seems his message traveled faster than his gift did. He died 6 days past, in the godswood of the Red Keep. Poison, some whisper, though of course no one whispers that where Grand Maester Pycelle can hear it." Jon felt the words land somewhere behind his ribs, though he had already half expected them, had known from Corliss Penny's face that the man he'd been describing was already gone. It was different, hearing it confirmed. It made the letter in his jerkin feel less like a warning and more like a tombstone. "He knew he was dying when he sent it," Jon said. "He said so himself in the letter, and whatever he sent you was worth a great deal to him, if he spent his last strength arranging it rather than his last days with his wife and son." Aemon turned his blind face toward Jon, and there was something uncannily direct in it despite the ruined eyes, as though the old man could read intent through sound and stillness the way other men read it through sight. "You did not come here to tell me an old friend of the crown is dead, Jon Snow. Every man at this wall will know that by tomorrow's supper regardless. You came because you don't know what to do with what he gave you, and you believe rightly, I think, that I might." Jon hesitated. He had promised himself, walking here, that he would be careful, would test the water before committing himself fully, and some part of him still believed that was the wise course. But looking at the old man now, hearing the quiet certainty in his voice, he found the caution simply didn't fit the moment. Jon Arryn had trusted a stranger's letter and a 19-year-old's judgment with the fate of the realm. If Jon couldn't trust Aemon, who had outlived 3 kings and buried the entire fallen dynasty of dragons within his own memory, then there was no one left worth trusting at all. "He found proof," Jon said, "that Queen Cersei's children aren't the king's. That's what killed him. He confronted someone close to her, I think her cousin, from the way the letter reads, and within days he began to sicken. He believed he was being poisoned for getting too close to the truth. He sent me everything he'd gathered because he was afraid to send it to my father, afraid Ned Stark would go straight at Robert and the Lannisters both, honest and unarmed, and get himself killed for his trouble. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Jon began to wonder whether he'd made a terrible mistake, whether even a man as old and as steeped in secrets as Aemon Targaryen would simply be unable to hold what he'd just been told without it costing something. But when Aemon finally spoke, his voice was calmer if anything than it had been a moment before, as though the news had settled something in him rather than shaken it loose. "Show me," he said. "Or rather, since I cannot see it, tell me everything in order exactly as it was given to you. Leave nothing out because you judge it unimportant. I have found across a very long life that the things men judge unimportant are usually the hinge the whole door swings on." So Jon told him. All of it, the genealogical record and its 4 generations of true Baratheon coloring, the Maester's notes on bloodlines, the Septon witness testimony from the serving girl named Sarah, and finally, haltingly, the letters between the Queen and her brother, the ones that left no room at all for any interpretation but the obvious and monstrous one. He recited what he remembered of the wording as closely as he could, and Aemon listened without interrupting once, his blind eyes fixed on some point past Jon's shoulder, his hands folded still in his lap. When Jon finished, the brazier had burned low, and the raven on the chairback had gone to sleep, and Aemon sat quiet for long enough that Jon began to think he'd fallen asleep too, until the old man finally exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry decades in it. "Incest," Aemon said, without flinching from the word, the way a man names a disease rather than a sin. "Between the Queen and her twin brother. That is not, in itself, a thing that has never happened before in the history of the 7 kingdoms, Jon Snow. My own house did this deliberately for 300 years, and called it holy rather than shameful. But my house did it in the open, sanctioned by custom and religion both, and every claim it produced was legitimate before gods and men, because everyone knew the truth of it from the start." He shook his head slowly. "This is different. This is not incest sanctified by an old dynasty's pride. This is incest hidden inside a marriage, producing heirs who will one day claim a throne under a false name and a false bloodline. That is not merely a sin, boy. That is treason of the deepest kind, a crime against the very idea of who is fit to rule. Jon Arryn believed the same. Jon Arryn was right to believe it and right to fear it, because a truth of that size does not merely embarrass a queen. It unmakes a succession. It unmakes a king's peace that has held, however imperfectly, for 15 years. Aemon's voice had gone quieter, almost to himself. "I remember the war that put Robert Baratheon on that throne. I remember what it cost, the trident running red, a city sacked, a dynasty ended in a single night of fire and butchery in the Red Keep cellars. Robert's claim to that throne rests on 2 things and 2 things only: that the Targaryens forfeited it through madness and cruelty, and that his own line will carry it forward legitimately from this day on. Take away the second of those, Jon Snow, and you do not merely disgrace a queen. You call into question whether the entire war that put Robert on that throne was worth its cost at all, because if his own children are bastards with no true claim, then what in the end did anyone actually win?" Jon hadn't thought of it in quite those terms, hadn't fully understood, until the old man said it aloud, exactly how deep the rot went, how far the tremors would travel once this particular stone was dropped. He'd understood the personal betrayal of it, Robert's own wife making a mockery of him for 15 years. He hadn't fully grasped the political fault line running beneath the entire realm. "Then what do I do with it?" he asked. "Jon Arryn told me to wait until I understood what I held before I used it, but he also warned that whoever comes after him won't be safe either. If my father goes south, if he takes the handship, he will take it, Eamon said, with the flat certainty of a man who had watched enough of history repeat itself to recognize the shape of it in advance. Robert loved Jon Arryn as a brother, and when a man like Robert loses a brother, he does not sit alone with his grief and think carefully about who to trust next. He reaches for the nearest thing that feels safe and familiar, and for Robert Baratheon, that will be Eddard Stark, the friend who has never once lied to him or flattered him or asked him for anything he didn't already owe. Your father will be summoned south before the month is out, Jon Snow. I would wager the Maester's chain around my neck on it. The words settled cold in Jon's stomach, because he'd already half suspected it, had already felt the shape of that inevitability pressing against him since he'd first read Jon Arryn's letter. But hearing it stated so plainly by a man who had watched kings rise and fall for 100 years made it feel suddenly, terribly immediate. His father walking south into a nest that had already killed one hand of the king without anyone at court so much as blinking. I have to warn him, Jon said. Whatever the risk of a raven carrying what exactly? Eamon's voice sharpened slightly, not unkind but insistent, the tone of a teacher correcting a student before a mistake becomes a habit. Think Jon Snow. Think the way Jon Arryn thought when he chose not to write to your father directly, when he chose instead to send proof to a boy at the wall that no one in King's Landing would think to watch. If you send a raven to Winterfell saying, "Father, beware, the Queen's children are false, do not go south," and that raven is intercepted, or read by a Maester loyal to someone other than your father, or simply noticed by anyone paying the smallest attention to unusual correspondence from Castle Black, you have done exactly what Jon Arryn feared his own investigation would do. You have announced to the very people who poisoned a king's hand that someone else now knows what he knew, and that someone else is connected to you, and through you to your father. You will have handed Cersei Lannister a map showing her exactly where the danger to her children now lives. Then, I do nothing. I let him walk south blind. I did not say nothing. Eamon leaned forward slightly, his blind eyes somehow finding Jon's face despite everything. I said not a raven, and not the truth itself, not yet. But there is a great distance between silence and recklessness, Jon Snow, and a clever man walks the whole of that distance without ever standing still. You can warn your father to be careful in King's Landing without telling him why. You can warn him that Jon Arryn's death was not natural, without yet telling him what Jon Arryn found. A father who trusts his son's judgment, and I would wager Eddard Stark trusts yours, more than most fathers trust bastard sons, from everything I've heard of the man, will heed a warning even without the whole of its reasoning, if the warning comes from someone he has no cause to doubt. Jon turned that over, feeling the shape of it settle into something workable. Not the whole truth, not yet, not by raven, not with Cersei's spies presumably combing through every unusual piece of correspondence touching the Stark name in the wake of Jon Arryn's death. But a warning, a caution, something a father could act on without needing to understand the full architecture of why. I could write to him, Jon said slowly, as though it were simple grief and simple worry. Tell him Jon Arryn's death troubles me more than an ordinary death should, that I've heard whispers even here at the wall questioning whether it was natural, and ask him, as a son might ask a father he loves, to be careful if Robert calls him south. Nothing that names Cersei. Nothing that mentions proof. Just a bastard son's unease, easily dismissed by anyone reading over his shoulder, but real enough that my father will feel it and remember it. Eamon was quiet a moment, and then, unexpectedly, he made a sound that might almost have been approval. That is not a bad beginning, Jon Snow. Careful and useful, and revealing nothing to anyone who might read it without understanding its full weight. You learn quickly for a boy who spent his whole life being told he was worth less than his brothers. The words caught Jon somewhere he hadn't expected to be caught, and for a moment he didn't trust himself to answer. He thought of Catelyn Stark's cold courtesy across a decade of suppers at Winterfell, of the careful distance his father had always kept even in his kindness, of every small way the world had made certain he understood his place before he was old enough to argue against it. He had made peace with all of it, or told himself he had. Hearing it named so plainly by a stranger in the same breath as genuine praise undid something small and old in his chest that he hadn't realized was still tender. "I've had practice being underestimated," he said finally, and it came out steadier than he expected. "Then use it," Aemon said simply. "The world will keep underestimating you, Jon Snow, for exactly as long as you let it. And I suspect there will come a day, sooner than either of us would like, given what you now carry, when being underestimated is the single greatest advantage you possess. Cersei Lannister has spent her whole life being watched, measured, weighed by every eye in that court for any sign of weakness or ambition. No one has ever thought to watch a bastard boy at the wall for anything at all. Do not squander that." Jon nodded slowly, and something in him, some tension he'd been carrying since he'd first broken the seal on Jon Arryn's letter, eased just slightly, replaced by something steadier. Purpose again. The same clean certainty from the night before. "There's one more thing," Aemon said, and his voice had shifted, gone quieter, more careful. "You spoke of the Maester's notes on bloodlines, the coloring, the traits that run true in House Baratheon across generations. May I ask who authored them?" "I didn't see a name on the notes themselves, only initials." GP Aemon's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "Grand Maester Pycelle. You know him." "I knew him when I still had eyes to see faces and legs strong enough to walk further than this tower's stairs allow me now." Something bitter had crept into Aemon's voice, old and worn smooth by long use, like a stone handled so often its edges had gone soft. "Pycelle has served 3 kings, Jon Snow, and survived every change of power that swept through that city by the simple, ancient art of always discovering which way the wind was blowing before he committed himself to a direction. If he wrote notes suggesting the Queen's children could not be Robert's, and those notes ended up in Jon Arryn's hands rather than buried in a locked drawer of the Citadel's archive, it means one of 2 things. Either Pycelle made an error in judgment he will spend the rest of his life regretting, believing perhaps that Jon Arryn's request was innocent curiosity, rather than the beginning of an investigation that would end in a queen's ruin. Or Aemon paused, and something in the pause felt heavier than anything he'd said before it. Or he wanted Jon Arryn to find it, Jon finished. Or he wanted Jon Arryn to find it, Aemon agreed. "I do not know which is true, and I would not ask you to guess in my place, because I have been wrong about Pycelle before, in ways that cost people I loved a great deal. But you should hold that question in your mind, Jon Snow, and turn it over from time to time, because the answer matters. A man who erred out of laziness or vanity is dangerous in one way. A man who deliberately fed a queen's enemy the tools of her destruction, and then presumably reported to that same queen everything Jon Arryn asked him, that is dangerous in an entirely different way, and a far more useful one, if you ever find cause to test where his true loyalties lie." Jon sat with that a long moment, the fire in the brazier reduced now to a low bed of orange coals, the cold of the tower beginning to press in around them both. He thought of a man he'd never met, sitting in some warm chamber in King's Landing, weighing kings and queens against each other like a merchant weighing coin, and felt a fresh unease settle alongside everything else he was already carrying. "What do I do with the proof itself?" he asked, "if I'm not to use it yet and not to send it and barely even to speak of it?" "You keep it," Aemon said, "and you keep it well. Not in your own chambers. Bowen Marsh already suspects something unusual arrived with that rider, and men who suspect things often go looking to satisfy their curiosity, whatever their intentions. Bring it to me. I have places in this tower no one thinks to search, not because they are cleverly hidden, but because no one imagines a blind old man has any use for hiding places at all. That is its own kind of protection, the same protection you enjoy simply by being a bastard boy no one watches. Let two overlooked things guard each other. And then you wait and you learn and you grow into whatever this is going to demand of you, because I promise you, Jon Snow, it will demand a great deal, and sooner than you think. Aemond's blind eyes turned toward the window again, toward the dark and the cold beyond it. I have lived through the fall of one dynasty already, in this very castle, receiving news of it exactly as you received your news last night. A letter, a rider, a truth too heavy to hold alone. I chose then to remain silent, to let the world burn without lifting a hand to change its course, because I told myself a maester's vows meant setting aside blood and crown both. I have had 60 years since to wonder whether that silence was wisdom or cowardice, and I have never once landed on an answer I was fully satisfied with. He turned back to Jon, and his voice, when it came again, had a weight in it that Jon would remember for a very long time afterward. I will not tell you to be silent, Jon Snow, the way I was. I do not believe silence is always the wiser road, whatever my vows might once have insisted. I will only tell you to be careful and patient and to strike, when the time comes to strike, with your eyes fully open to what it will cost. That is the only wisdom I have left worth giving. 2 weeks later, on a gray morning heavy with the promise of rain, Eddard Stark rode south from Winterfell with King Robert Baratheon himself, having accepted, after considerable and visible reluctance, the office of Hand of the King. Jon received the news by Raven at Castle Black 3 days after the fact, in a letter from his sister Sansa that mentioned it almost as an afterthought amid a great deal of excitement about traveling south herself and meeting a real prince, and something cold settled into Jon's chest reading it, because Aemon had been right, exactly as Aemon had predicted, and knowing that didn't make the knowledge any easier to carry. He had sent his own letter 3 days before that news reached him, careful, restrained, exactly as he and Aemon had discussed. A bastard son's unease dressed up as nothing more dangerous than grief for a man he'd barely known. I have heard whispers here, even at the edge of the world, that question whether Lord Arryn's death was as natural as the Grand Maester claims. I do not know if there is truth in it, but I would ask you, Father, if you are called south for any reason, to be careful of wine you did not pour yourself, and food you did not see prepared, and to trust no one at that court more than you would trust a stranger on the road. I know I have no right to ask this of you, and no proof to offer beyond an unease I cannot fully explain. I ask it anyway, because I would rather you think me foolish than lose you to something I might have warned you against. He didn't know, sitting in the cold of his cell reading Sansa's cheerful letter about King's Landing and lemon cakes, and a prince named Joffrey she seemed to have already half fallen in love with from nothing but a single meeting, whether his own letter had reached Winterfell before his father departed south, or whether it sat now, unread, in some drawer at Winterfell while Ned Stark rode unwarned into exactly the danger Jon had tried to describe. There was no way to know. There was only the waiting, and the low, constant hum of worry that had settled into him since the night the chest arrived and had not once, in the weeks since, fully gone away. He threw himself into training instead, because it was the only thing he could do with the restless energy that worry produced. And allies are thorn, never a man to look a gift in the mouth, whatever its source, noticed the change and used it without mercy. Jon fought harder in the yard those weeks than he had in the whole of his training before it, sparring with a focus that left even Halder and Gren wary of drawing his attention. And more than once Thorne paused mid-lesson to study him with something that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't quite its opposite either. "You've got something eating at you, Snow," Thorne said one gray afternoon, after Jon had put 3 recruits on their backs in quick succession without breaking a proper sweat. "Whatever it is, keep feeding it to your sword arm. Might make a ranger of you yet, bastard blood and all." Jon didn't answer. He'd learned in the weeks since the chest arrived that some silences were worth more than any words he could offer, and this was one of them. 500 miles south, in a chamber of the Red Keep hung with tapestries older than the Targaryen dynasty itself, Cersei Lannister stood at a window overlooking the bay and listened to Grand Maester Pycelle finish his report with the particular careful attentiveness she gave to anyone whose loyalty she had cause to question. "Nothing further has surfaced among Lord Arryn's remaining papers, Your Grace," Pycelle said, his old voice thin and reedy in the stone chamber. "We have gone through everything twice now, every ledger, every letter, every note in his own hand from the past 2 years. If he was in the process of some investigation, as you feared, he left nothing behind to show it, nothing at all." Cersei did not turn from the window. Below in the harbor, a merchant ship was unloading crates of something, wine likely, or spices, some ordinary cargo for an ordinary trade that had nothing at all to do with the careful, quiet war she'd been fighting since the day Jon Arryn had come to her rooms with a question about her children's coloring dressed up as idle curiosity, and she had known, the moment he asked it, exactly what he was really asking. "Nothing, Your Grace." Whatever concerns troubled him, if any did, he appears to have kept entirely in his own mind, without committing them to paper. "Perhaps," Pycelle added, with the particular oiled carefulness of a man testing whether a suggestion will be welcomed or punished, "there was nothing to find at all. Grief and illness can make old men imagine conspiracies where none exist." Cersei turned from the window then, and studied him, the stooped shoulders, the trembling hands, the watery eyes that had watched 3 kings rise and fall from this same chamber, and somehow always managed to be standing on the winning side when the dust settled. She did not entirely trust him. She had never entirely trusted him, but he had served her purposes reliably enough across enough years that distrust had settled into something closer to careful management than genuine fear. "You believe that, Grand Maester, that an old man simply imagined a conspiracy in his final weeks out of nothing more than illness and grief?" "I believe," Pycelle said carefully, "that if there was anything to find, my searches would have found it, and they have found nothing." That at least troubled her. Because a man like Jon Arryn, careful, methodical, a man who had spent 30 years building a reputation for exactly this kind of patient, thorough work, did not simply investigate something dangerous and leave no trace of it. He gathered proof. He kept records. That was the very nature of him, the trait that had made him valuable as a hand for 15 years, and it did not simply vanish because the man himself had died. Which meant, if there was nothing left to find among his papers, that whatever he had gathered had either been destroyed by his own hand before his death, or, and this was the possibility that had been keeping her awake at night, turning it over and over without ever quite settling on an answer she trusted, it had left the Red Keep entirely, sent somewhere beyond her reach before anyone thought to look for it. "Have you questioned his steward?" she asked. "Vardy's Edgett, the old man who served him 30 years. "I have, Your Grace. He claims to know nothing of any unusual business in his lord's final days, beyond the ordinary grief and confusion that surrounds any man's death." "He's lying." Pycelle blinked, startled by the flatness of her certainty. "Your Grace, I have no particular reason to believe. A man serves his lord for 30 years, Grand Maester, And when that lord dies suddenly of an illness no one can properly explain, the steward claims to know nothing at all unusual happened in the final days. No unusual visitors, no unusual errands, no strange requests. Cersei's voice had gone soft, the way it always did when she was at her most dangerous, a fact that anyone who had served her long enough learned to recognize and fear in equal measure. Either he's lying or he's a fool, and in 30 years of service to a man as careful as Jon Arryn, I doubt very much he had room to be a fool. What would you have me do, Your Grace? Nothing for now. She turned back to the window, watching the merchant ship finish its unloading, small figures moving in patterns that meant nothing to her, that were simply ordinary life continuing in a city that had no idea how close its foundations had come to cracking. If we press him too hard, too quickly, he'll simply go quiet entirely, or worse, he'll flee, and a fled steward is a confession all its own that half the court will notice within a week. Watch him instead, quietly. See where he goes, who he speaks to, whether any letters leave his hand that don't need to. Men who are hiding something eventually make a mistake if you give them enough rope and enough time to hang themselves with it. And if he made no mistake before we began watching, if whatever was sent before Lord Arryn's death, weeks before we had any cause to watch anyone at all, that was, Cersei thought, precisely the question that had been eating at her for days, and she did not appreciate having it said aloud, however reasonably, in her own chamber. Then we find out where it went, she said. However long that takes, and we deal with whoever holds it, whoever that turns out to be. I did not survive 15 years in this city, playing this particular game against men far more dangerous than a dead hand's grieving steward, by leaving loose threads simply because pulling them proved inconvenient. Pycelle bowed, the particular deep, careful bow of a man eager to leave a conversation that had grown more dangerous than he'd anticipated when he walked in. As you say, Your Grace, I will have him watched. After he left, Cersei remained at the window a long while, her arms crossed against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She thought of her children, Joffrey, 13 now, and already showing every sign of the cruelty she'd have to spend the rest of her life managing rather than curing, Miecella, gentle and green-eyed, and utterly innocent of the storm that might one day break over her simply for existing, Tommen, soft and sweet, and hopelessly unfit for the throne he might one day have to fight for regardless. She thought of Jaime, 500 miles away at Casterly Rock's shadow doing whatever their father demanded of him, unaware, or perhaps simply unwilling to fully absorb, how close the whole architecture of their shared secret had come to collapsing. And she thought of Ned Stark, riding south even now with Robert at his side, honest and unbending and utterly incapable, from everything she'd ever observed of the man, of leaving a wrong unaddressed once he'd found it. If Jon Arryn had suspected something, and Jon Arryn had known Ned Stark for 30 years, loved him like a brother by every account she'd ever heard, was it truly so unthinkable that Jon Arryn might have written to him, might have sent something north to Winterfell before his death caught up with him? The thought had occurred to her before, and she had dismissed it before, because a raven to Winterfell would have been the obvious, expected move, the kind of thing her own spies would have noticed and reported within days. But Jon Arryn had not been an obvious man. He had been careful, patient, methodical, precisely the kind of man who might have understood that the obvious move was also the most dangerous one, and chosen something else instead. She did not know what that something else might have been, but she intended to find out, whatever it cost, because a secret of this size, sitting unaccounted for somewhere in the world, was a knife aimed permanently at her children's throats, and Cersei Lannister had never once in her life been the kind of woman who left a knife lying within reach of her enemies without at least trying to find out whose hand might one day pick it up. At Castle Black, The days grew slowly longer as the last edges of a mild winter finally gave way to something like proper spring, and Jon Snow settled into a rhythm that felt, on the surface, entirely ordinary: training in the yard, drilling with Sam over old books in the library, standing watch in the cold hours before dawn atop the wall itself, staring north into a darkness that had never once, in all his months at Castle Black, given him any real reason to fear it. But underneath the ordinary rhythm, something else had begun to grow, a patience Jon hadn't known he possessed until Jon Arryn's letter demanded it of him, and a clarity of purpose that had, without his fully noticing it happen, changed the way he carried himself. He no longer flinched, even slightly, at Thorne's casual cruelties about his birth. He no longer felt the old familiar ache when he thought of Winterfell, of Robb and Catelyn's careful distance, of a hall he'd grown up in but never quite belonged to. Something in him had shifted, settled into a kind of quiet confidence that had nothing to do with his name or his birth, and everything to do with what he now knew he was capable of holding, and eventually, when the moment came, using. He wrote to his father again, 3 weeks after the first letter, careful and restrained as before, asking simply whether he'd arrived safely, whether the city agreed with him, whether he'd heard anything further about the circumstances of Lord Arryn's death. He received no answer for nearly a month, and when it finally came, it was brief and careworn in a way that troubled him more than any length of silence could have. John, I have arrived, and I am well enough, though this city does not suit me, and I do not expect it ever will. Your letter reached me before I left Winterfell, and I have not forgotten what you wrote in it. I am being careful, more careful perhaps than you know, though I cannot explain in a letter why that caution feels so necessary. There are things happening here that trouble me more than I expected, and I find myself wishing more than once already that I had your judgment beside me rather than 500 miles north of it. Take care of yourself at the wall. Whatever else is true, I am glad, more than I have said to you often enough over the years, that you are my son. Your father. Jon read it 3 times over, sitting alone in his cell with the last of the day's light fading through the narrow window, and felt something in his chest tighten and ease at once, tighten, because things happening here that trouble me more than I expected was not the language of a man entirely at peace with what he'd found in King's Landing, and ease, because for the first time in his life, his father had written to him not as a duty owed to a bastard son, but as a man speaking honestly to someone whose judgment he trusted. He folded the letter and placed it carefully, alongside Jon Arryn's own, in the small hidden space behind a loose stone in his cell's wall, not the full chest, which remained with Aemon in the tower, but the 2 letters that mattered most to him now. The dead man's warning and the living man's careful, worried honesty. Outside, the wall stretched white and enormous against a darkening sky, and somewhere beyond it, in the depths of a forest no one at court had bothered to think about in generations, something was beginning to stir that would eventually matter more than any throne in Westeros, though Jon did not know that yet, could not know it. Standing at the edge of everything with a secret in his chest, and a father's careful words folded against his heart. He only knew, standing there in the cold, that the waiting was almost over, one way or another, and that when it ended he intended to be ready for whatever came next. Chapter 3. Ravens and Shadows. Varys had learned long ago that the most dangerous silences in King's Landing were never the ones that lasted, but the ones that stopped too abruptly, like a held breath let out before its time. He had noticed one such silence 3 weeks past, small and easily dismissed by anyone less attentive than himself, and it had been sitting in the back of his mind ever since like a splinter he couldn't quite work free. A rider named Corlys Penny had left the city the night before Jon Arryn died, carrying, according to the stable master who'd saddled his horse, A debt payment for some officer of the watch, nothing worth remarking on. Corliss Penny had returned to King's Landing 11 days later, thinner, saddle-sore, and had not, so far as any of Varys' little birds could determine, spoken a single word to anyone about where he'd been or what he'd carried. He had collected a modest payment from Vardy's agent, Jon Arryn's steward, and had then quietly disappeared into the city's teeming anonymity, exactly the sort of man who was paid precisely so that he might vanish afterward without ever becoming a loose thread worth pulling. Varys had pulled it anyway, because pulling threads was, in the end, the entire substance of his existence, and because a rider dispatched the night before a hand of the king's death, on an errand described only vaguely, and involving a debt payment to the watch, was exactly the sort of detail that men far less careful than himself would have dismissed, and men far more dangerous than himself would eventually notice. He raised the matter, delicately, over wine in Petyr Baelish's solar, because Littlefinger was one of the few men in the city whose curiosity ran as deep as his own, and because two spiders working the same web sometimes caught more than one working alone, though Varys never once forgot, even as he spoke, that Petyr Baelish's help came at a price that was rarely stated but never truly free. A debt payment to the watch, Littlefinger repeated, turning the words over with the particular relish he reserved for anything that smelled of a secret worth having. How marvelously dull. I do wonder why you're troubling yourself with it, unless of course it isn't dull at all, and you've simply chosen the least interesting words in the language to describe something that keeps you awake at night. I sleep very well, Lord Baelish. Varys smiled, soft and round and utterly without menace, the smile that had disarmed 1,000 men who ought to have known better. I am only a careful man, in a city where carelessness so often ends in a knife between the ribs, and yet here you are, asking me about a rider and a debt, 3 weeks after Jon Arryn died coughing blood into his own godswood. Littlefinger sipped his wine, watching Varys over the rim of the cup with an expression that could have meant anything at all. You think someone sent something north, before he died. You think he knew what was coming for him, and he did something about it before it arrived. I think, Varys said carefully, that Jon Arryn was not a fool, and fools rarely see poison coming in time to do anything at all about it, whereas careful men sometimes have a week or two of warning if the poison is slow enough and their own instincts are sharp enough. I think if he suspected something worth dying over, he would have wanted to protect it before he lost the chance. And you believe it went to the wall? Littlefinger's eyes had sharpened, the idle amusement fading into something more genuinely interested. That's a curious guess, little bird. Of all the places a dying hand might send a secret worth protecting, why on earth the wall? There's nothing there but ice and criminals and men too poor or too disgraced to matter to anyone. Precisely, Varys said, which is exactly why it might be the wisest place in the 7 kingdoms to hide something. No one watches the wall, Lord Baelish. No one has watched the wall in a generation. If I wanted to hide a truth that could unmake a kingdom, I would not hide it among the great houses, where every letter is weighed and every messenger followed. I would hide it somewhere so thoroughly beneath everyone's notice that no one would think to look, precisely because looking there would never occur to them at all. Littlefinger set down his wine, and for a long moment he said nothing, his fingers drumming a slow, absent rhythm against the arm of his chair. You haven't told the Queen any of this, he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. Should I have? I imagine you're weighing whether it's worth more to you kept quiet than sold to her. Littlefinger's smile was thin and sharp. Which is, I confess, exactly what I'd be doing in your position. Knowledge only has value for as long as no one else has it, Lord Varys. The moment you hand this to Cersei Lannister, it becomes hers to use, and you become simply the man who told her, useful perhaps, but spent. Whereas if you hold it a while longer, quietly, and see where it leads before anyone else knows to look. You assume a great deal about my intentions, Lord Baelish. I assume you're exactly as clever as I am, Littlefinger said, which means you're thinking exactly what I'm thinking, which is that whoever finds this thing first, whatever it turns out to be, holds something more valuable than gold, more valuable than any office in this city. A secret that can break a queen is worth more sitting quietly in your own hand than it is worth handed over to hers for whatever thanks she cares to offer, which in my experience of the woman is generally rather less gratitude than the service deserved. Varys said nothing to that, because there was nothing useful to say, and because he had, in fact, already decided precisely what Littlefinger had guessed he'd decided, that this particular thread was too valuable and too dangerous to hand to Cersei Lannister before he understood exactly what it was and exactly who now held it. He would keep watching. He would keep his little birds listening at the wall's few connections to the wider world, the ravens that occasionally carried news south, the rare merchant who traded with Castle Black, the even rarer recruit who returned to visit family before vanishing north again for good. Sooner or later, something would surface. He simply had not counted on Cersei Lannister reaching the same conclusion at almost precisely the same time, and moving on it far more quickly than he'd anticipated. Cersei received Vardy's Edge's steward, not the man himself, who had proven maddeningly unhelpful under 3 separate rounds of careful, deniable questioning, but a scullery boy who had once worked briefly in the Arryn household before being dismissed for theft, and who now, for a sum of gold that would keep him fed for a year, was willing to remember a great deal more than he had admitted to anyone before. He rode out at night, the boy said, twisting his cap in his hands in the small antechamber where Cersei had arranged to meet him, well away from anyone who might report the meeting to the wrong ears. The night before the old hand fell sick proper, I heard the stable master grumbling about it the next morning, said Vardy's had him saddle a fast horse in the dark and didn't explain why, paid extra for the trouble of it. Do you know where the rider went? North, my lady. That's all anyone said. North on the King's Road, riding like his life depended on it. North on the King's Road led to a great many places. Winterfell, the Eyrie by a different branch, the wall itself at the very end of it, past everything else that mattered. But a rider sent secretly at night, the evening before a dying man's illness truly took hold, that was not the behavior of a steward settling an ordinary debt. That was the behavior of a man protecting something, moving it out of reach before it could be seized. She thought of the wall almost immediately, and dismissed the thought almost as quickly, because it seemed absurd on its face. Why would Jon Arryn, dying and desperate, send proof of a stolen throne to a fortress of criminals and outcasts at the very edge of the world, where it could do no one any good at all? And yet the very absurdity of it nagged at her, because Jon Arryn had not been a foolish man, and a foolish choice from a careful man was often, on closer examination, not foolish at all, merely unexpected, chosen precisely because it was unexpected. She thought, too, of Ned Stark, 500 miles north at Winterfell when Jon Arryn died, now installed as Hand of the King in the very chambers his dead friend had occupied, walking the same halls, asking. She had already heard whispers of this from her own people among his household, a great many careful, uncomfortable questions about the circumstances of his predecessor's death. Ned Stark had a bastard son at the wall. Everyone knew it. It was hardly a secret, merely an embarrassment the North seemed remarkably unbothered by. If Jon Arryn had wanted to send something beyond her reach, beyond even Ned Stark's reach until Ned himself was ready to receive it, a bastard boy training with the Night's Watch, entirely outside the great game, utterly unwatched by anyone who mattered, was exactly the kind of unlikely vessel a careful, desperate man might choose. The thought settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in ripples she did not enjoy following to their conclusions. She summoned Sir Osric Crale 3 days later, a hedge knight of modest reputation and considerable debt, a man who had fought passably in a handful of minor tourneys and owed the crown, through channels she had arranged personally and untraceably, rather more gold than he could ever hope to repay through honest means. He was not a man anyone would remember fondly, but he was competent with a blade, patient, and most importantly, utterly without any loyalty that gold and the forgiveness of debt could not purchase outright. "You understand what I'm asking," she said, when he stood before her in a private chamber well removed from the Red Keep's more frequented halls, his hat in his hands, sweat beading faintly at his temples despite the cool of the room. "I take the black," Sir Osric said slowly, as though testing whether he'd understood correctly. "I go north to the Wall. As a criminal given the choice of the Wall or the headsman's axe for," he hesitated. "For whatever crime we invent for you," Cersei said, with the particular flat patience of a woman explaining something to a man she did not respect but currently required. "It hardly matters what. Debt, theft, some violence against a lesser lord who won't be difficult to arrange as an accuser. The Watch takes men of far worse character than whatever fiction we construct for you, and asks few enough questions once they've taken their vows. You will be, to everyone at that castle, simply another broken man given a second chance at the edge of the world. No one there watches new recruits with any particular suspicion. Why would they? Half the Watch is built from men exactly like the one you'll be pretending to be. And once I'm there, you watch. Quietly, patiently. I understand patience is not your natural gift, Sir Osric, so I will say this only once and expect you to remember it. You do not ask direct questions. You do not go digging through chambers or cornering stewards. You watch and you listen, and above all you watch a boy named Jon Snow, Lord Eddard Stark's bastard, because I believe something was sent to him before Jon Arryn died that I need found and destroyed. If you find it, you bring it to me, by whatever means keeps it from anyone else's eyes along the way." If the boy proves to be an obstacle to that, she let the sentence trail deliberately and watched Sir Osric's face carefully as the implication settled into him. "You want him dead. I want the problem solved," Cersei said. "How you solve it is your own affair, provided it's done quietly, and provided nothing traces back to this room or to me, or to House Lannister in any form whatsoever. If you succeed, your debts are forgiven in full, and there will be gold enough besides to buy yourself a life somewhere far from any place that remembers your face. If you fail, again," she let the silence finish the thought for her, and Sir Osric, to his credit, did not need it spelled out any further. "And if there's nothing there at all. If I search a season and find nothing worth finding, then you will have spent a season pretending to be a broken man among other broken men, and you will come home with your debts forgiven regardless, because I do not believe in punishing loyal service simply because the world proved less tidy than I hoped." Her mouth curved, thin and cold. "But I do not think you'll find nothing, Sir Osric. I think Jon Arryn was too careful a man to send a rider 500 miles north in the dead of night for nothing at all." Sir Osric Crale, soon to be renamed, for the purposes of his invented crime and his invented disgrace, plain Osric Payne, a debtor caught cheating at dice and threatening a moneylender's collector with a knife when confronted about it, hardly a crime worth remembering in a city full of worse, left the Red Keep 2 days later in a small party of similarly disgraced men bound for the Wall, escorted by a single disinterested guardsman who had been paid well not to look too closely at any of his charges, and had absolutely no idea, boarding the wagon that would carry him north over the following month, precisely how far out of his depth he was about to find himself. Ned Stark, meanwhile, had begun to find pieces of the puzzle that his son had already assembled in full, though he did not yet understand how completely he was retracing a path someone else had already walked. He had found the book first, the same genealogical record of House Baratheon's coloring that Jon Arryn had pored over in his final weeks, tucked into a shelf in the solar Ned now occupied, as though the dead man had left it there deliberately, or simply hadn't had the strength to move it before the end came for him. Ned read it late one night, by candlelight, in the same chamber where his old friend had once ruled the 7 kingdoms in Robert's name, and felt a cold, creeping unease settle into him, as he compared the passage on true Baratheon coloring against the faces of the 3 royal children he'd watched grow up alongside his own over the years of occasional visits north and south. He did not leap to conclusions the way a lesser man might have. He was Ned Stark, and Ned Stark did not build a house on a single stone without testing every other stone around it first. He went quietly to visit a woman named Barra in Fleabottom, having heard whispers, the same whispers, unknowingly, that had led Jon Arryn to the same door months before, of a girl fathered by Robert during one of his careless nights away from the Red Keep, and he stood in a doorway smelling of poverty and old cooking fat, and looked down at a child with black hair and eyes so deep a blue they were nearly violet, and felt the first true weight of what he was beginning to suspect settle onto his shoulders. He did not, in these early weeks, connect any of it to his own son at the Wall, 500 miles north, holding proof of the very thing he was only beginning to piece together for himself. He had no reason to. Jon Arryn had died before he could send word to his oldest friend directly, and Ned Stark, for all his honesty, for all his careful, deliberate nature, had no way of knowing that the truth he was slowly assembling from scraps and whispers had already arrived, whole and irrefutable, in his bastard son's hands weeks before. He wrote to Jon only once during this period, the letter Jon had already received and read 3 times over, brief, careworn, admitting to troubles he couldn't yet explain, and then buried himself in the slow, dangerous work of confirming what he suspected, unaware that confirmation had already been sitting, patiently, in the last place in the 7 kingdoms anyone would think to look for it. The new recruits arrived at Castle Black on a raw gray afternoon in early autumn, a dozen men in various states of dishevelment and resignation, herded off a supply wagon by a watch officer who'd collected them from the King's Landing dungeons, and a handful of other stops along the King's Road. Jon had seen recruits like this arrive before, thieves, debtors, the occasional genuinely violent man given the wall as a mercy in place of the headsman's axe, and he barely glanced at them from across the yard, more concerned with the practiced sword in his hand and the bruised grin had just left on his forearm. Sam noticed the new man first, in the way Sam noticed most things, quietly, thoroughly, and usually before anyone else thought it worth the attention. "That one's odd," he said, 3 days after the recruits arrived, nodding toward a lean, hard-faced man sharpening a blade near the armory with the kind of easy, practiced competence that most of the debtors and drunks who came through Castle Black's gates simply didn't possess. "Osric Payne. He fights better than a man who got sent here for cheating at dice ought to fight." "Plenty of men lie about why they're here," Jon said, only half paying attention, still working the ache out of his forearm. "That's not what I mean." Sam's voice had dropped, careful. "I mean he fights like someone trained him properly, for money, not like someone who learned to swing a blade in a tavern brawl. And he asked me yesterday, entirely by the way, whether I knew anything about a rider who'd come through a few months back. Said he'd heard talk of it on the road south, some rumor about a mysterious delivery to a recruit here. I told him I didn't know what he meant." Jon went still, the ache in his arm suddenly the furthest thing from his mind. What did he look like when you told him that? Disappointed, Sam said, just for a second. And then he smiled and changed the subject, easy as anything, like it had never mattered at all. But it mattered, Jon. I could see it mattering. Jon turned that over carefully over the following days, watching Osric Payne without ever seeming to watch him, the way Aemon had taught him. Or rather, the way Aemon's advice about being underestimated had taught him to apply himself to watching others in turn. Osric Payne trained hard and competently, but never so well that he drew Thorne's particular attention. He kept mostly to himself, spoke little, and on the 2 occasions Jon observed him closely enough to be certain, his eyes drifted toward Jon far more often than any casual interest could explain, quick, assessing glances, the kind a man gives when he's measuring a target rather than simply passing the time. He brought it to Aemon that same week, in the old man's chambers with the brazier lit low against the evening cold. A man came in the last group of recruits who asks questions about riders and deliveries, and watches me more than a stranger has any reason to, Jon said. I think Jon Arryn's letter, and the questions Cersei's people asked about it, finally reached far enough that someone's been sent to find what I'm holding. Aemon was quiet a long moment, his blind eyes fixed on nothing. Then the game has come to your doorstep sooner than I hoped it would, Jon Snow. I had thought we might have a year, perhaps 2, before anyone thought to look this far. It seems I underestimated the Queen's patience for loose threads. What do? You do not confront him directly, not yet, not without proof of what he intends, because an accusation without evidence against a new recruit will look, to Thorne and to Mormont both, like a bastard boy inventing enemies out of guilt over something he's been hiding. You watch him more carefully than he watches you, and you let him make the first move, because a man sent to find something and eliminate whoever holds it will eventually have to act, and a man forced to act on someone else's timeline rarely acts as cleverly as he'd like to. Aemon's voice had gone sharp, focused, the voice of a man who had spent a very long life thinking exactly these kinds of thoughts. And you keep the boy, Samwell Tarly, close and warned, because if this man has already begun asking him questions, he may try Sam again, more directly, if he grows frustrated with how little you've given him to work with. Jon nodded slowly. And Ghost, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched Aemon's mouth. Keep him close as well. I have heard a great deal about that wolf of yours, Jon Snow, even from an old blind man who cannot see him. Direwolves do not take kindly to men who mean harm to those they've bonded with. I would trust that animal's instincts a good deal further than I'd trust my own eyes, if I still had them. The confrontation came 11 days later, on a night thick with the kind of deep, bone-aching cold that settled over Castle Black in the weeks before the first true snows, when most of the garrison had retreated indoors, and only the men on watch duty walked the yard at all. Jon had drawn a late shift on the wall itself that night, standing the cold hours before dawn with a lantern and a spear and Ghost padding silent circles around the base of the winch cage. And he was midway through the 3rd hour of his watch, half lost in thought about a father he hadn't heard from in 3 weeks, and a letter he still hadn't found a safe way to send, when Ghost's low growl cut through the quiet like a blade. Jon turned, spear already lowering into a ready grip, years of Thorne's brutal instruction settling into his body before his mind had fully caught up with what was happening. Osric Payne stood perhaps 15 feet away at the edge of the lantern's light, a long knife already bare in his hand, his face utterly without the careless, easy expression he'd worn for the last 2 weeks, cold now, focused, the face of a man who had decided the time for patience was over. You've been asking questions, Jon said, not moving, keeping the spear low and ready. About riders, about deliveries. Samwell told me. The fat boy's got a loose tongue. Osric's voice was flat, conversational almost, the tone of a man discussing the weather rather than approaching a killing. Doesn't matter now. I've watched you 3 weeks, Snow. You're careful enough that I don't think I'll get another chance to ask you nicely, so I won't bother trying. Whatever Jon Arryn sent you, wherever you've hidden it, tell me now, and there's a chance I let you keep breathing long enough to regret it. Say nothing, and we do this the hard way. Who sent you? Doesn't matter who sent me. It matters to me. Jon's voice was steady, calm in a way that seemed to unsettle the other man slightly. Some flicker of surprise crossing his face at a boy who wasn't shaking, wasn't begging, wasn't doing any of the things a frightened recruit facing a trained killer in the dark ought to be doing. You've come a long way to threaten a bastard over papers you haven't even seen. That's not a hedge knight's errand. That's someone important's errand. Cersei Lannister's, I'd guess, given everything else. Something in Osric's face tightened at the name, confirmation enough without a single word needing to follow it. And then he moved, fast, far faster than his easy, unremarkable training yard performances over the last 2 weeks had ever suggested. The knife coming up in a short, brutal arc meant to open Jon's throat before he could so much as raise his spear properly. Jon had spent 3 months training against Alliser Thorne's deliberate, escalating cruelty, learning to read weight and intention in half a heartbeat, because the alternative was simply losing, over and over, until the lesson finally sank in. He read the strike now the same way he'd learned to read Gren's telegraphed swings in the yard, the shift of weight, the angle of the shoulder, and stepped sideways rather than back, letting the knife pass a hand's width from his throat while the spear's haft came around and cracked hard across Osric's forearm. The knife didn't drop. Osric was too well trained for that, but the strike bought Jon half a second, and half a second, against a man who'd expected an easy kill, was more than enough. Jon drove the spear's butt into Osric's ribs, hard, felt something give beneath the blow, and Osric staggered back with a grunt of genuine pain, the first real sound of surprise he'd made since the fight began. "You're better than they said," Osric managed, circling now wary, the knife held lower and more carefully than before. "Who's they?" Osric didn't answer. He came again, feinting low and then reversing high, a professional's trick meant to catch an amateur flat-footed, and it would have worked on most of the recruits Jon trained alongside. Would have worked, probably, on Jon himself 3 months earlier, before Thorne's relentless cruelty had ground the amateur mistakes out of him one humiliation at a time. It didn't work now. Jon caught the reversal a fraction of a second before the blade reached him, twisted the spear haft up to block, and felt the shock of impact run up through both his arms as steel met ash wood hard enough to nearly numb his hands. And then Ghost hit Osric from the side. The direwolf had been circling the whole fight, patient and silent the way Ghost always was, waiting, Jon understood later, turning it over, for exactly the moment his bonded companion needed him most rather than simply the first opportunity to intervene. Ghost's jaws closed on Osric's knife arm with a force that dropped the man screaming to the frozen ground, the blade skittering away across the ice. And for one terrible, suspended moment Jon thought Ghost might simply tear the arm free entirely. "Ghost, enough!" Jon's voice cracked out sharp and immediate, and the direwolf released his grip, backing half a step, teeth still bared, Osric's blood dark on the white fur around his muzzle. Osric lay on the ground clutching his ruined arm, breathing hard through gritted teeth, and Jon crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and put the point of the spear against his throat before the man could think of reaching for anything else. "Now," Jon said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very still in a way that frightened Osric pain rather more than the direwolf's teeth had, "you're going to tell me exactly who sent you and exactly what you were told to find, or I'm going to let him finish what he started." "You wouldn't." Osric's voice shook despite the bravado in the words. "The Watch doesn't kill its own. You're not one of the Watch. You never were. You're a Lannister blade wearing black to hide it, and everyone in this castle is going to know that the moment I drag you into the yard bleeding from a direwolf bite with a knife on the ground beside you." Jon pressed the spear a fraction closer, not enough to break skin, enough to make the point of it clear. "The Lord Commander will hang you for this regardless of who sent you, Osric. That's the truth of what happens next, whatever you tell me. The only question left is whether I tell him everything you say to me now, or whether I tell him you attacked me for reasons unknown and let him draw his own conclusions. Give me a reason to be kind about it." Osric was silent a long moment, pain and calculation warring visibly across his face, and then slowly something in him gave way, the particular collapse of a man who has run out of better options and finally accepts it. "Cersei Lannister," he said, the words coming fast now, almost relieved to finally say them aloud. "She had my debts arranged, my crime invented, sent me north with the other recruits. I was told to watch you, find whatever was sent to you before Jon Arryn died and bring it back or destroy whoever held it if the finding proved too difficult." His breath hitched, pain flaring visibly across his face. "That's everything. That's all I know. I don't know what it is. She never told me, just that it mattered enough to kill for. How were you meant to report back, if you'd found something? A raven, coded, a simple cipher, nothing complicated, sent to a house in the city that forwards it on. I don't know who receives it after that. I never asked, wasn't paid to ask." Jon studied him a long moment, weighing the truth of it, and found, turning the man's words over against everything Jon Arryn's letter and Aemon's warnings had already prepared him to expect, that it fit together too neatly to be anything but genuine. Cersei Lannister had noticed the missing thread after all, faster than either he or Aemon had quite hoped for, and had reached, with the same cold efficiency Jon Arryn's letter had warned him to expect, directly for the wall. He called for help then, Pip first, who came running at the sound of Jon's voice cutting through the night, and within minutes half the garrison seemed to have woken, drawn by the commotion, lanterns bobbing across the yard as men gathered around a bleeding, captured man and a boy standing over him with a direwolf at his side, utterly composed, utterly in control of a scene that would have left most 19-year-olds shaking and incoherent. Lord Commander Mormont himself arrived within the quarter hour, roused from sleep, his face thunderous in the lantern light as he took in the scene, Osric bound now, his arm crudely splinted by Sam's shaking but competent hands, and Jon standing calm and unbothered beside him, as though he'd simply won another sparring match in the yard, rather than survived an assassination attempt in the dark. "Someone had better explain this to me," Mormont said, "and it had better be the truth, because I am far too old and far too tired to be lied to at this hour of the night." Jon looked at Aemon, who had been woken and brought as well, wrapped in furs against the cold, his blind face turned toward the sound of Mormont's voice with an expression Jon couldn't quite read. And then Jon looked at Mormont directly, and made, in that moment, a decision he had been quietly preparing himself to make for weeks without fully realizing it, that some truths, told carefully and to the right person, were safer spoken aloud than buried any longer. "It will take some time to explain properly, my lord," Jon said, "but I think you should hear all of it, and I think, once you have, you'll understand why I couldn't tell you sooner." Mormont's eyes moved from Jon, to the bound and bleeding man on the ground, to Aemon, whose careful stillness told its own story to anyone paying close enough attention, and something in the old commander's weathered face settled into the particular grim patience of a man who had led the Night's Watch long enough to recognize when the world beyond the wall had finally, unavoidably, come knocking at his gate. "Then you'd best come inside," he said, and you'd best start talking. I have a feeling, Snow, that I'm not going back to sleep tonight regardless of what you tell me." Behind them, Osric Payne was hauled away toward the ice cells to await whatever judgment the Watch's law demanded of a man who'd taken the black under false pretenses and drawn steel against a brother of the Order. A fate that would, within the week, cost him his life on the chopping block regardless of who had sent him. Because the Watch, whatever else could be said of it, did not forgive that particular betrayal lightly. But somewhere south, in a chamber high in the Red Keep, a raven that would never arrive was already being watched for, and Cersei Lannister would learn in time that her carefully chosen agent had failed, and worse, that his failure had exposed, for the first time, exactly how far she was willing to go to protect a secret she still did not know had already outrun every trap she'd set to catch it. Chapter 4. The Hand Falls. Lord Commander Jeor Mormont's solar was warmer than most rooms at Castle Black. A fire built up properly despite the hour, and Mormont himself sat behind his heavy oak desk with his hands folded and his raven, the foul-tempered old bird that never left his shoulder for long, perched silent and watchful on the chair back beside him, as though it too understood that whatever was about to be said in this room mattered more than the ordinary business of the Watch. Jon stood before him with the chest open on the desk between them, its contents laid out in the same careful order he'd first arranged them in weeks ago, and told the whole of it: Jon Arryn's letter, the genealogical record, the Maester's notes, the Septon's testimony, the letters that left no room for doubt. Aemon sat nearby, silent through all of it, his blind eyes fixed somewhere past the fire, occasionally nodding at some detail as though confirming to himself that Jon's telling matched what he already knew. Mormont did not interrupt once. He listened the way he listened to a scout's report from beyond the wall, grim, patient, absorbing every word without wasting breath on questions, until the whole shape of the thing had been laid before him. When Jon finished, the fire had burned down to embers, and the silence that followed stretched long enough that Jon began to wonder whether the old man had simply stopped believing him partway through. "You understand," Mormont said finally, his voice low and rough, "exactly what you're telling me. You're telling me the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms has been bedding her own brother for the better part of 2 decades, that her children have no true claim to the throne they're meant to inherit, and that this—" he gestured at the papers on his desk with something close to distaste, as though they were diseased, "is proof enough to burn the whole Baratheon succession to the ground the moment it's spoken aloud in the wrong hall. Yes, my lord. And you've held this for months." Alone save for Maester Aemon and the Tarly boy, Mormont's eyes moved to Aemon. "You knew of this?" "I did," Aemon said simply. "The boy came to me the night it arrived, exactly as he ought to have. I told him to hold it and to keep it hidden and to wait until he understood what he held before he used it. I stand by that counsel, Lord Commander, whatever else you think of it. And the man in the ice cells tonight, the one who tried to gut you on the wall, Snow, was sent by the Queen herself to find this and destroy whoever held it." Mormont's jaw worked, and for a long moment Jon thought the old man might simply refuse the whole of it, might order the papers burned and the matter forgotten. The way Mormont had a reputation for handling anything that threatened to drag the Watch into the world's politics. The Watch takes no part. That was the old law, older than the Targaryens, older than most of the great houses now squabbling over a false throne. We are the shield that guards the realms of men. We do not choose sides in the wars of southern lords. "My lord," Jon said, before Mormont could speak further, "I understand what the Watch's law says about staying out of the realm's quarrels. I've heard it said to me 100 times since I took my vows. But this isn't a quarrel between 2 lords over a border or a debt. This is the throne itself, resting on a lie, and if it's allowed to stand, the man who sits on it next will be a boy with no right to it at all, ruling in the name of a war his father supposedly won. I didn't ask to be given this. I didn't go looking for it. But now that I have it, I can't simply pretend I don't, and I won't pretend the Watch has no stake in who rules the realm we're sworn to protect. Because if the wrong king sits that throne, and the realm tears itself apart fighting over who deserves it, no one's going to remember to send us men, or grain, or gold, while whatever's coming from beyond the wall keeps coming regardless of who's fighting whom in the south. Something shifted in Mormont's face at that, not agreement exactly, but the particular respect of an old soldier recognizing an argument built on more than youthful idealism. "You've thought about this longer than tonight," he said. "I've thought about little else for months, my lord." Mormont was quiet a while longer, his fingers drumming slowly against the desk, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had gone lower, more careful. "The Watch does not choose King Snow. I won't pretend otherwise, not to you, not to myself. Whatever's in these papers, I intend to keep the Watch itself out of using them directly. No letters sent in the Watch's name, no official word from this castle to any court in the south. That much I will insist on, and you'll not argue me out of it. I wasn't going to ask that of you, my lord." "Good, because I'd have refused you." Mormont's eyes were sharp now, assessing. "But I'll not pretend the Watch has no interest either, not after tonight. A man came into my castle wearing black under false pretenses, murdered no one only because a wolf and a boy proved harder to kill than his mistress expected, and I intend to see him hanged for it before this week is done, whatever letters follow after. That much I can do within the Watch's own law, without ever touching the politics underneath it. As for you—" He paused, and something almost like reluctant amusement crossed his weathered face. "You've held a secret that could burn 2 kingdoms to the ground, kept your head about it for months without a single misstep that I can see, and put down a trained killer in the dark without so much as raising your voice about it afterward. I've had rangers twice your age who'd have handled either of those things worse. I'll not tell you to bury this, Snow, because I don't believe you would, and I'm not certain I'd be right to ask it of you even if I thought you might listen." "Then what would you have me do, my lord?" Mormont exhaled, long and slow, an old man's weariness settling visibly over him. "I'd have you be as careful with the rest of this as you've been so far, because the woman who sent that man tonight isn't going to stop simply because her first attempt failed. She'll try again, likely sooner rather than later, and likely with someone cleverer than the fool you put down in the yard. And I'd have you think carefully about your father, because from everything you've told me, Eddard Stark is standing closer to this fire than any of us, and he doesn't yet know it's burning." The words landed heavy in Jon's chest, exactly where he'd been carrying that same fear for weeks now. "I've written to him, carefully, without saying too much. Careful may not be enough much longer." Mormont's raven shifted on its perch, ruffling its feathers with a low croaking sound, and the old commander glanced at it with the particular fondness men reserve for creatures that have outlasted every other companion of their youth. A man in King's Landing asking the same questions his old friend asked before he died. That's not a man who's going to stay safe much longer, whatever warnings you've managed to send him. I'd think on that, Snow, and think hard, because I have a feeling the choice about when to act on what you're holding may not stay yours to make for much longer. Sometimes the world decides these things for you, whether you're ready or not. Jon left the Solar an hour before dawn with the chest carried carefully back to Eamon's tower, the cold air outside sharp enough to clear his head after the weight of everything spoken in that room, and stood for a long moment beneath the pale, star-scattered sky, thinking of his father 500 miles south, walking closer to the fire than any of them, without ever knowing his own son already held the water that might put it out. Osric Payne died 4 days later, on a gray morning with a light snow falling, his head taken by Lord Commander Mormont's own sword before the assembled garrison of Castle Black. His crime read aloud plainly: taking the Black under false pretenses, drawing steel against a brother of the Watch with intent to kill, acting as an agent for interests beyond the wall in violation of every vow he'd sworn. No mention was made of Jon Arryn or Cersei Lannister, or the papers that had brought him north in the first place. Mormont kept his word about that much, letting the Watch's own ancient law handle a matter the Watch's law was fully equipped to handle without ever touching the politics beneath it. But word of it traveled anyway, the way word always traveled south along the King's Road. A Watch recruit executed for attempted murder within weeks of taking his vows, an unusual enough occurrence that merchants carried the story with them as easily as they carried spices and wine, until eventually, inevitably, it reached ears in King's Landing that had been waiting, with growing impatience, for exactly this kind of news. Cersei received the report from a merchant contact 3 weeks after the fact, delivered in the careful, deniable language such reports always used. A man matching the description of the one she'd sent north had been executed at the wall for an unspecified crime against the Night's Watch, and no further word of him had followed. She read the message twice in the privacy of her own chamber, and felt something cold and furious settle into her chest that she did not allow to show on her face for even a moment when Jaime found her there an hour later. "You've had bad news," he said, reading her the way only he could, the way 20 years of shared blood and shared secrets had taught him to read every small shift in her expression. "My man at the wall is dead." Jaime's jaw tightened. Then whatever he found nothing, or he found something and died before he could send word of it, which amounts to the same result either way. Cersei crumpled the letter in her fist, slow and deliberate. A dead knight and a bastard boy at the edge of the world who somehow managed to kill a trained man without so much as a scratch, from what little the report describes. That's not luck, Jaime. That's not a debtor and a fool stumbling into each other in the dark. Someone at that castle is protecting whatever Jon Arryn sent, and protecting it well enough to survive an assassin sent specifically to remove them. Then send another, and risk another failure, another dead man whose crime traces back, eventually, to whoever gave the order. Cersei crossed to the window, arms folded tight against her chest, looking out over a city that had no idea how close its foundations had already come to cracking twice now, and might yet crack a third time if she wasn't careful. "I've spent weeks reaching for a threat 500 miles away, and twice now I've reached and come away with nothing but a dead man, and a growing suspicion that whoever holds this is cleverer than either of us has given them credit for. That ends now. I'll not keep throwing knives into the dark at an enemy I can't even properly see. If the proof is beyond my reach at the wall, then I make certain it stays beyond everyone's reach who might use it against us, starting with Ned Stark, who's been asking questions of his own here in the city that trouble me a great deal more than anything happening 500 miles north." Jaime's face had gone carefully neutral, the particular stillness he wore when he disagreed with her, but had learned, across 2 decades, that disagreeing openly rarely changed her mind, and usually only cost him standing he might need later. "You mean to move against Stark directly?" "I mean to protect our children, Jaime, however that has to happen." She turned from the window, and there was nothing soft left in her face at all. "Robert's hunting again in 3 days. He's been talking of it for a week. Some notion of a boar in the Kingswood that's caught his fancy. He'll want wine on the hunt, the way he always does, and Lancel will be there to serve it to him, the way he always is." Jaime went very still. "Cersei, he's dying anyway, Jaime. Fat drunk, disinterested in every duty of the throne he never wanted, letting Stark run the realm in his name while he chases boar and whores and forgets he has children at all. I'm not doing anything the wine hasn't already been doing to him for 15 years. I'm only choosing when. And Stark. If Robert dies with Stark as hand, with Stark already suspicious of everything he's found, then Stark falls with him, one way or another, because a hand without a king to protect him is nothing at all, and I intend to make certain there's no king left to protect him the moment Robert's breath stops. Something almost like relief crossed her face, the particular relief of a woman who has finally, after weeks of reaching blindly at a threat she couldn't locate, found a threat close enough at hand to actually strike. I can't reach whatever Jon Arryn sent north, but I can reach the man standing closest to the fire here in this city, and I intend to make very certain he burns before he learns enough to use whatever he's found. Ned Stark confronted her 4 days before the hunt, in the Godswood at dusk, the same place his predecessor had collapsed and died months before, a detail Ned had chosen deliberately, though he never said so aloud, because some part of him wanted her to feel the weight of that place, the same weight he'd felt every time he'd walked through it since taking Jon Arryn's old office. "I know," he said, without preamble when she appeared at his summons, flanked by 2 of her own guards who kept a respectful distance beneath the pale trees. "About your children, about Jaime. I've had proof enough for weeks now, though I've held my tongue while I decided what honor demanded I do about it." Cersei's face did not change, not visibly, though something in her eyes went very cold and very still. "You're a fool, Lord Stark, if you think honor is going to protect you for saying such a thing aloud. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to give you a chance my predecessor never got, because whatever else you are, you're a mother, and I've a mother's love in my own house that I'd not wish to see broken over a matter I could have handled with more mercy than the truth deserves." Ned's voice was steady, grim, the voice of a man who had already weighed this decision from every angle and found it, however distasteful, the only honorable path left to him. "Take your children and go, Cersei. Tonight, if you can manage it, south to Dorne or across the narrow sea, anywhere far enough that Robert's wrath can't follow when I tell him what I've found. I'll give you that much time. I won't give you more. You'd let me flee." Something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps, or contempt, or some complicated mixture of both. "How very noble of you, Lord Stark. How very like everything I've heard said of you since the day you rode into this city." "I don't do it for you," Ned said flatly. "I do it because your children are innocent of whatever sin their parents chose, and I'll not see them burned for a lie they didn't tell. Robert would kill them, Cersei, the moment he learned the truth. You know that better than I do. I'm offering you the only mercy left in this, which is time enough to save them from a fate they never earned." Cersei studied him a long moment, the dying light filtering through the pale branches overhead catching something unreadable in her green eyes, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone soft in the particular way that anyone who knew her well would have recognized as far more dangerous than open fury. "You think I haven't already thought of fleeing, Lord Stark? You think I haven't spent every night for 15 years lying awake calculating exactly how far I'd have to run, and how fast, if a man like you ever worked up the courage to say what you've just said to my face?" She stepped closer, and there was nothing of fear in the movement at all, only a cold, controlled fury that made Ned's hand drift, unconsciously, toward the hilt at his belt. "I have spent my whole life in a city built by men who took what they wanted and called it destiny, married to a man who never once loved me, mother to children I will not, see hunted down like animals because their father lacked the imagination to see what was happening in his own bed for 15 years. You want to know why I haven't fled, Lord Stark? Because fleeing means my children die anyway, hunted by whoever's clever enough to catch them, and staying at least gives me a chance to fight for them with whatever weapons this cursed city has left me. Then you leave me no choice but—" "You have already made your choice," Cersei said, cutting across him, and something in her certainty made the hair on the back of Ned's neck rise despite himself. "You made it the moment you decided to warn me rather than simply act against me, Lord Stark. And I think, whatever comes of tonight, you're going to spend a great deal of time wondering whether that mercy was wisdom or the single greatest mistake of your entire honorable life." She left him standing alone in the godswood as the light finally failed entirely, and Ned watched her go with a cold, creeping unease settling into his chest that he could not quite name, though some part of him, the same part that had survived a war and a rebellion and every treacherous turn of politics since, understood dimly that he had just handed a dangerous woman exactly the warning she needed to strike first. 3 days later, Robert Baratheon rode into the Kingswood after a boar that would, within hours, tear open his side with a tusk, while a drunk king too slow and too heavy to properly defend himself laughed at his own clumsiness, even as the beast gored him. The wine that dulled his reflexes that morning had been poured by Cersei Lannister, exactly as it had been poured every morning for months, exactly as Jon Arryn had once suspected without ever living long enough to prove it beyond doubt, stronger than usual, mixed with something that slowed a man's hands and blurred his judgment just enough to turn an ordinary hunt into a death sentence. Ned Stark rode beside him when the boar broke from the tree line, and would spend the rest of his life, however short that life proved to be, wondering whether faster reflexes, or less wine in his own cup, or simply better luck, might have let him put a spear through the beast before it reached the king at all. He carried Robert back to the Red Keep himself, the king's blood soaking through his own clothes, Robert's ragged, half-delirious voice muttering apologies and regrets, and finally, in the last clear moments before the fever truly took him, a confession scrawled with a shaking hand naming Eddard Stark protector of the realm until Robert's heir came of age, a document that would have changed everything, had it named the right heir at all, had Robert understood, even in his dying breath, exactly whose blood truly ran in the children he called his own. Ned held that letter through the long, terrible hours of Robert's death, and made, in the privacy of his own grief and fear, the decision that would seal his fate more surely than anything Cersei Lannister had done to poison a boar hunt. He changed the wording, quietly, deliberately, striking Robert's own chosen phrase and writing instead that the throne would pass to his rightful heir, refusing to name Joffrey directly, believing, in the last honest corner of his honorable heart, that this small act of caution might buy enough time to see the truth spoken before a false king could be crowned. It bought him nothing at all. Grand Maester Pycelle carried word of the king's death to Cersei before the ink on Ned's altered letter had properly dried, and by the time Ned stood before the small council to have that letter read aloud, Cersei Lannister already knew every word of it, already understood exactly what Ned intended, and had already, with the same cold efficiency she'd shown in every crisis of her adult life, begun arranging exactly how his defiance was going to end. Petyr Baelish's gold cloaks took Ned Stark in the throne room itself, before he'd finished speaking the words that were meant to save the realm from a lie. His own household guard cut down around him in the chaos, his leg shattered by a blade before he understood the betrayal had already happened, before he understood that the man he'd trusted to secure the city gates had sold him to Cersei Lannister for a promise of advancement that would, in time, cost the whole realm far more than either of them yet understood. He was thrown into a cell beneath the Red Keep with his leg unset and his household scattered, and somewhere above him, in a throne room hung with banners that no longer told the truth about who had any right to sit beneath them, a boy named Joffrey Baratheon, golden-haired, green-eyed, utterly without any true claim to the crown now settling onto his head, was proclaimed king of the 7 kingdoms, while his mother watched from the steps below the throne with an expression of perfect practiced grief for a husband she had killed and perfect, practiced pride for a son who was not, and had never been his. The Raven reached Castle Black 9 days later, carrying news that had already traveled the length of the Kingsroad twice over by the time it arrived, garbled and half-rumored by every mouth that passed it along. The king was dead. The hand of the king had been arrested for treason. A new king sat the throne, and no one at Castle Black, gathering in small, worried knots across the yard to trade half-truths and speculation, seemed entirely certain of the shape of any of it. Jon received the confirmed version from Aemon himself, who had read the official Raven, sent formally to every castle and holdfast in the realm, announcing the new king's ascension in language stiff and careful enough to have clearly passed through several hands before it left King's Landing. In the privacy of his tower, his blind face grave in a way Jon had rarely seen it. "Your father is alive," Aemon said, before Jon could ask, understanding exactly which words mattered most in the moment. "Imprisoned and gravely wounded from what the Raven describes, but alive, charged with treason for conspiring to seize the throne for himself. A charge, Jon Snow, that I would wager everything I own is a lie constructed to hide the truth of what actually happened." Jon stood very still in the middle of the tower room, the words landing one after another like blows he'd half expected and still hadn't fully braced for. His father, imprisoned, treason, a false king already crowned. "Robert's dead," he said slowly, turning the shape of it over. "And my father's in a cell, and Joffrey, Cersei's boy, sits the throne now. That is what the Raven says, and I have no reason to doubt the broad shape of it, whatever lies have been layered over the details." Aemon's voice was careful, deliberate, a man choosing his words with the weight of everything they'd need to carry. "I told you once, Jon Snow, that Eddard Stark would be summoned south before the month was out, and that summons would place him closer to danger than any warning we could send might fully protect him from. I did not expect the danger to move quite so fast, nor quite so far, but I cannot say I am wholly surprised by it either. Cersei Lannister does not survive 15 years in that court by moving slowly once she's decided a threat requires ending." Jon crossed to the narrow window, looking out over the darkening yard, his hands gripping the stone sill hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. Somewhere south, his father lay in a cell with a broken leg, charged with a crime he hadn't committed, at the mercy of a woman who had already proven, twice now, exactly how far she was willing to go to silence anyone who threatened her children's claim. "I've been careful for months," Jon said, and his voice, when it came, had a hardness in it that Aemon had not heard from him before, not the quiet, patient resolve of the boy who'd first come to this tower with a chest full of secrets, but something sharper, more immediate, a man's fury finally breaking free of the caution that had contained it for so long. "I've waited. I've hidden this. I've listened to every careful word you've given me about patience and timing, and not squandering what I hold before I understand it fully. And now my father is in a cell, likely to lose his head for a crime he didn't commit, while the woman who put him there sits a golden-haired boy on a stolen throne and calls it justice. Jon, I understand what you're going to say. I understand the danger of moving too fast, of alerting enemies before I'm ready, of squandering an advantage I've spent months protecting." Jon turned from the window, and there was nothing hesitant left in his face at all, nothing of the careful, deferential boy who had first sat across from Aemon and asked what to do with a truth too heavy to hold alone. "But I didn't take this into my hands to protect myself, Maester. I took it because Jon Arryn believed I could use it to save my family when the moment came that using it mattered more than hiding it. That moment is here. My father's life is the price of any more waiting I do, and I will not pay that price simply because caution says I should." Aemon was quiet a long moment, His blind eyes turned toward Jon with an expression that held something between pride and profound worry in equal measure. "What do you intend to do, Jon Snow?" "I don't fully know yet," Jon admitted, and the honesty of it cost him something, but he said it anyway, because pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of cowardice. "But I know I'm not going to sit at this wall and train in a yard while my father waits for the headsman's axe. I know I'm done protecting a secret for its own sake, done being careful simply because careful has kept me safe. I have proof enough to unmake the boy sitting that throne the moment it's spoken in the right ears, and I intend to find those ears, whatever it costs me to reach them. That may mean leaving the watch, Jon Snow, breaking vows you swore before the old gods and the new. You understand what that costs a man, what it's cost men before you, in ways that follow them for the rest of their lives. I understand it." Jon's voice didn't waver. "I took those vows believing they'd ask me to guard a wall against the dark and nothing more. I didn't take them believing they'd ask me to watch my father die for a lie I could unmake with the papers sitting in that chest below us. If the Watch's law truly demands I choose between my vows and my family's life, then I'll make that choice with my eyes open, and I'll carry whatever it costs afterward. But I won't pretend the choice isn't already made in my heart, because it is, and it was made the moment that Raven told me my father was in chains." Outside, the wind had picked up hard against the tower's old stones, carrying the first true bite of winter's approach, and somewhere beyond the wall itself, in the deep cold dark that no one in the Seven Kingdoms had bothered to think about in generations, something ancient and patient continued its own slow gathering, utterly indifferent to the fall of kings or the rise of false ones, waiting for a season that would, before long, matter more than any throne at all. But that reckoning was still to come, still hidden beyond the edge of anyone's sight. For now, there was only a boy standing in a cold tower with his fists clenched and his father's life hanging in the balance, and a decision, finally made after months of careful waiting, that the time for hiding was over. "Then let's begin," Eamon said quietly, and there was something almost like relief in the old man's voice, the relief of a man who had spent 60 years wondering whether his own silence had been wisdom or cowardice, finally watching someone choose differently. "Tell me exactly what you intend, Jon Snow, and let an old blind man help you build it properly, because a fire lit in anger burns bright and dies fast, and what you're about to start needs to burn a great deal longer than that if it's going to save anyone at all." Chapter 5. The cloak left behind Mormont's, Raven screamed the moment Jon stepped through the solar door, an ugly, rattling sound that made the old man wave a hand at it without even looking up from the papers in front of him. "Quiet, you miserable creature." He set down his quill, folded his hands, and studied Jon with the particular weariness of a man who had already guessed why he'd been asked for another private audience less than a week after the last one. "You've come to tell me you're leaving." "Yes, my lord. Tonight. Before dawn, if I can manage it." Mormont exhaled slowly through his nose, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, only looked at Jon with an expression that mixed frustration and something that might, in a kinder light, have passed for respect. "You understand the law, Snow. I don't have to recite it to you. You've heard it sung in that hall 100 times since you took your vows. A man who deserts the night's watch forfeits his life, the moment he's caught, no matter how good his reasons were for going. I have hanged men for less than what you're proposing to do tonight. I understand it, my lord. And you're still going. My father is in a cell in King's Landing with a shattered leg, charged with a crime he didn't commit, and I'm holding the one thing in the Seven Kingdoms that could save his life if it reaches the right hands in time." Jon's voice was steady, unhurried, the voice of a man who had already made peace with the cost of what he intended, and simply needed the room to understand it. "I took vows to guard the realms of men, my lord. I don't believe letting my father die for a lie I could unmake counts as keeping them." Mormont's mouth twisted, not quite a smile, not quite a grimace, something in between, the expression of a man who'd spent 40 years enforcing a law he'd occasionally wished he could break himself. "You could ask the Wall's law to bend. I could send a raven to the Citadel, petition for a formal dispensation. That would take weeks, my lord, and my father may not have weeks." "No," Mormont admitted quietly. "He may not." He looked past Jon, to where Aemon sat near the hearth, silent through the whole exchange, his blind eyes fixed on some point in the fire's glow. "You've counseled him in this, Meister." "I have counseled him in a great many things over these past months," Aemon said. "I do not believe I could counsel him out of this one, even if I thought it wise to try, and I confess I am no longer entirely certain I do think it wise to try. There comes a point, Lord Commander, where an old man's caution simply becomes another man's cage." Mormont was quiet a long while after that, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the desk's scarred wood, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped low, almost conspiratorial, the voice of a commander choosing his words with the particular care of a man about to do something he'd deny having done if ever asked directly. "I am an old man, Snow, and my memory has grown poor these last years. Ask anyone in this castle, Bowen Marsh will tell you I forget where I've left my own boots half the mornings I wake." His eyes, sharp despite the words, held Jon's without blinking. "If a black cloak were found folded neatly on an empty bed tomorrow morning, and no one troubled to report it to me before midday, I dare say I might not notice it missing at all until it was far too late to send anyone after it. A careless old commander might sleep straight through the whole business." Jon understood, in that moment, exactly what was being offered, not permission, because Mormont could never openly give that without breaking the Watch's own law in front of every man who might one day use the precedent against him, but something almost as valuable. A night's worth of deliberate blindness, enough of a head start that by the time any one official noticed Jon Snow was gone, he'd already be far enough south that chasing him would look like exactly the pointless, embarrassing exercise Mormont clearly intended it to look like. "Thank you, my lord." "Don't thank me." Mormont's voice had gone rough. "If you're ever caught wearing that cloak again south of the Wall, I'll have no choice but to treat you as any other deserter, whatever debt I feel I owe you tonight. I'd have you understand that clearly before you walk out that door. The law doesn't bend twice for the same man, Snow, whatever it does the first time." "I understand, my lord." "I hope you do." Mormont rose, slow and heavy with age, and crossed to where a modest chest sat against the wall, his own stores, Jon realized, not the Watch's. He drew out a purse of coin, heavier than Jon expected, and set it on the desk between them without ceremony. "Take this. A man traveling south needs coin more than he needs speeches, and I've little else to give you that would matter half so much. And take the Tarly boy, if he insists on going, which I expect he will the moment he learns you're leaving without telling him. He's a coward about a great many things, that one, but I've never once known him to be a coward about the things that actually matter." Jon almost smiled, despite everything. "He'll insist, my lord." "Then let him. Two heads see more of the road ahead than one, and from what Aemon tells me, that boy's got a mind worth more than his belly suggests." Mormont's face, for just a moment, softened into something almost fatherly. "Go on, then. Say your goodbyes to whoever needs them and be gone before the sun's fully up. And Snow," he paused, and something rour crossed his weathered features, "whatever you find south of here, whatever this costs you in the end, know that you did more good for this realm in half a year at this castle than most men manage in a lifetime of easier choices. That's worth remembering on the hard nights ahead. I suspect there'll be a great many of them." Sam wept a little when Jon told him, though he tried and mostly failed to hide it, wiping at his face with the back of his sleeve, while pretending to be entirely occupied with the packs he was already, without being asked, beginning to fill. "You weren't going to tell me," he said, not quite an accusation, more a wounded observation. "I was going to tell you before I left. I wasn't planning on asking you to come." "Well, I'm coming." Sam said it with more firmness than Jon had heard from him in months, cinching a strap tight with hands that had gone steadier over half a year at the wall than they'd once been. "You'll need someone who can read a map properly, and someone who remembers half of what's in those papers well enough to recite it if the original copies are ever lost or stolen, and someone to talk sense into you when you're about to do something reckless, which I expect will happen rather more often than either of us would like. It's dangerous, Sam. I know it's dangerous. I was there when that man tried to open your throat on the wall, Jon. I'm not likely to forget how dangerous it is." Sam's voice wavered just slightly, before steadying again. "But I'm not letting you ride south alone with the only proof in the world that could save your father, while I stay here and pretend to be brave by staying safe. I've spent my whole life being the coward everyone expected me to be. I'd like, just once, to be something else." Jon looked at him a long moment, soft, awkward, endlessly apologetic Samwell Tarly, who had nonetheless kept a secret that could unmake kingdoms without a single slip in 6 months, who had stood in the yard with a splinted arm's worth of courage the night Osric Payne bled onto the ice, and felt something warm settle into the cold, urgent center of his chest. "You've already been something else," he said, "for a while now." They spent the remaining hours before dawn making copies, Sam's careful hand duplicating the Meister's genealogical notes and the Septon's testimony onto fresh parchment, while Eamon dictated from memory the substance of the letters between Cersei and Jaime that Jon judged too dangerous to carry as originals across 500 miles of open road. 3 sets in the end. One Jon would carry himself, sewn into the lining of his cloak where a casual search wouldn't find it. One Sam carried, hidden inside the spine of an old, worthless book about hedge maintenance that no thief would ever think worth stealing. And one Eamon would keep, sealed and hidden in his tower, a final safeguard should everything else be lost along the road. Copies without the original letters lose some of their weight, Eamon warned, as the last candle burned low toward morning. A copy can be denied as forgery far more easily than a woman's own hand can be denied as her own. Keep the true letters closest to you, Jon Snow, wherever you go, because they are the spine of everything else. I intend to. And when you reach Winterfell, because I assume that is your first destination and a wise one, you will need to decide quickly who to trust with the whole of it and who to trust with only pieces. Robb Stark is your brother in every way that matters, but he is young, and grief and fury make even good men reckless. Test his temper before you hand him a weapon big enough to start a war neither of you can fully control. Jon nodded slowly, filing the warning away alongside everything else the old man had taught him across the last 6 months. "I'll be careful. You will be as careful as the moment allows," Eamon corrected gently, which is not always the same thing as careful, and there is no shame in that distinction. "Go on now. The sun waits for no man, and neither, I suspect, does whatever is coming for your father in that city." Alizer Thorne found them at the stables just past the false dawn, Ghost already pacing restless circles near the gate, packs loaded, 2 horses saddled and breathing steam into the gray morning cold. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and something in his narrow, weathered face suggested he'd already guessed exactly what he was looking at. "Running, Lord Snow." His voice carried its usual venom, though something beneath it surprised, perhaps, that this particular boy hadn't simply broken and fled months ago when the world first pressed down on him, made the insult land softer than it might once have. "Not running." Jon checked the last strap on his saddle without hurrying. "Leaving. There's a difference." "Is there?" Thorn stepped further into the stable, blocking most of the light from the door. "The law calls it desertion either way, boy, whatever pretty word you dress it in. I could have you in irons before you clear the gate. You could try." Something flickered across Thorn's face at the flatness of that answer. Not fear exactly, but a recalculation. The same look Jon had seen cross Osric Payne's face in the moment before their fight had truly begun. Thorn had spent 6 months testing Jon in the training yard, breaking him down and building him back up out of pure, deliberate cruelty, and some part of him, Jon suspected, understood better than most at Castle Black exactly how much that cruelty had actually cost him in the end. "The Lord Commander know about this?" Thorn asked instead, choosing, Jon noted, not to test the threat any further. "You'd have to ask him." "I intend to." "Then you'll find him remarkably forgetful this morning, I expect." Jon swung up onto his horse, Ghost falling in at the animal's flank without needing to be called. He looked down at Thorn from the saddle, and for the first time in 6 months of every small cruelty the man had inflicted on him, Jon felt nothing at all resembling the old resentment, only a kind of tired, distant pity for a bitter man who'd spent his whole life mistaking cruelty for strength. "You could have made a decent officer of me without half the venom, sir," Jon said. "I'd have learned just as fast." "I doubt that." But something in Thorn's voice had lost its usual edge, and he stepped back from the stable door without another word, letting Jon and Sam ride past him out into the pale, freezing morning, watching them go with an expression Jon didn't turn back to read. Behind them, in the small cell Jon had called his own for 6 months, a black cloak lay folded neatly on an empty bed, exactly as Mormont had suggested it might, waiting for whoever eventually found it to draw whatever conclusions they cared to draw. 500 miles south, in a chamber lined with small, listening shadows, Varys received word of Jon Snow's departure from the Wall 3 days after it happened, carried by a little bird who traveled south with a supply wagon and reported, almost as an afterthought amid a dozen other small observations, that the Stark bastard's gone missing from Castle Black, and there's talk his cloak was found folded on his bed, though the Lord Commander's saying nothing official about it. Varys sat with that piece of information a long while, turning it over in his soft, careful hands, weighing it against everything else he'd gathered in the months since a rider named Corlys Penny had ridden north on a debt errand no one could quite explain. A dead knight executed at the Wall for attempted murder. A bastard boy who'd killed a trained assassin without a mark on him. And now that same boy gone from the Wall entirely, riding, where? South, almost certainly, given the timing. Toward Winterfell, most likely, where his brother was already mustering the north in response to his father's arrest. "He's carrying it," Varys murmured to himself, alone in the dim quiet of his chamber. "Whatever Jon Arryn sent him, he's carrying it south now, while the city burns around his father." The question that mattered was what to do with that knowledge. He could sell it to Cersei. She would pay handsomely, and gratitude from a queen who just crowned her son was not nothing, however little he trusted her memory to hold that gratitude for long. He could sell it to Littlefinger, who would undoubtedly find some way to turn it to his own advantage that Varys couldn't yet predict. Or he could do nothing at all, and watch, the way he'd watched 100 other secrets play themselves out across 30 years in this city, waiting to see which way the wind finally settled before he committed himself to a direction. He thought of Robert's children, golden-haired, false-blooded, sitting a throne that belonged, in truth, to no one currently living who wanted it, save perhaps a bitter man on Dragonstone who'd spent his whole life being overlooked in favor of a brother everyone loved more. He thought of the wars that would follow if this secret broke wrong, badly, without care. The realm torn between 5 claimants instead of settling cleanly on one. Exactly the kind of chaos that had cost the 7 kingdoms dearly once already, within living memory. when a mad king and a rebellious lord had broken a dynasty between them. He thought, too, of a boy at the wall who had killed an assassin without hesitation and ridden south into the heart of that danger anyway, rather than hiding, rather than waiting for someone else to solve the problem for him. Interesting, Varys said softly to no one at all, and made in that quiet moment a decision he would not share with Littlefinger, or with Cersei, or with anyone else in the city who might have used it against the boy riding south with a secret in his cloak lining and a direwolf at his side. He sent instead a single small bird north along the King's Road, not toward the wall, where it would arrive too late to matter, but toward Winterfell, carrying nothing more than a brief, unsigned warning meant to reach whoever needed it most. The Queen knows something rides south from the wall. She has sent men to stop it reaching Winterfell. Watch the roads. He did not know, sending it, whether it would arrive in time to matter. But it cost him little to try, and Varys had learned, across 30 years of careful, deniable choices, that the smallest mercies sometimes prove the most valuable investments a man could make. Littlefinger, for his part, had reached much the same conclusions Varys had, rather more slowly and with rather less generosity in what he intended to do about them. He had spent the weeks since Ned Stark's arrest carefully cultivating his position as the man who had, quite literally, delivered the city's gates into Cersei's hands, a position of considerable new influence that he had no intention of squandering on anything so foolish as loyalty to a secret he hadn't personally profited from yet. He watched Sansa Stark instead, in the days following her father's arrest, offering small mercies and careful kindnesses that cost him nothing and bought him, he judged, a great deal of quiet trust from a frightened girl with no one else in the city she could turn to. If the truth of Cersei's children ever broke publicly, and Littlefinger had begun, cautiously, to suspect it might, given the rumors trickling south about a dead knight at the wall and a missing Stark bastard, he intended to be standing close enough to whatever chaos followed to claim whatever advantage the wreckage offered, whichever way the throne ultimately settled. He said nothing of any of this to Cersei, when she summoned him 3 days after Robert's death to discuss the small matter of Eddard Stark's continued, inconvenient survival. He should have died already, Cersei said, pacing the length of her solar with the particular restless energy of a woman who had expected a problem solved days ago, and found it still, stubbornly, breathing. Every day he lives is a day someone might listen to whatever he was fool enough to try telling the small council before your gold cloak stopped him. Killing him outright creates its own problems, Your Grace, Littlefinger said mildly. His daughters are here, in this city, under your protection or your custody, depending on how uncharitably one describes it. The North will not take his death quietly, whatever charge you dress it in, and a war with the North while your son's crown is barely a week old is not, I think, the beginning you'd have chosen if given the luxury of choosing. Then what would you have me do? Let him live and let him talk. I'd have you use him, Littlefinger said, and something in his soft, careful voice made Cersei pause mid-stride to look at him properly. A confession, freely given in exchange for his life and the Black. He names himself a traitor before the whole city, publicly, humiliatingly, his own honor turned into the very weapon that destroys whatever credibility his suspicions might carry afterward. No lord in the realm rallies behind a confessed traitor's wild accusations, Your Grace, however true they might privately believe them to be. You keep your war from starting, and you bury whatever he knows under a mountain of his own admitted guilt, all without needing to spill a drop of Stark blood that might otherwise come looking for vengeance. Cersei studied him a long moment, and something in her face suggested she was turning the idea over with rather more approval than she wanted to show him directly. And if he refuses to confess, then you have his daughters, Littlefinger said simply. And I suspect a father who has already proven himself willing to walk into a lion's den for the sake of protecting innocent children will find it very difficult indeed to refuse, once the alternative is made sufficiently clear to him. Cersei said nothing further on the matter, but the small, considering silence that followed told Littlefinger everything he needed to know about which path she intended to walk, and he left her solar that evening with the quiet, private satisfaction of a man who had just ensured, however the truth eventually broke, that he would be remembered as the one who'd offered mercy rather than the one who'd demanded blood, a reputation worth considerably more, in the long run, than any single secret currently riding south from the Wall. The ambush came on the 4th day south of the last hearth turnoff, in a stretch of the King's Road that ran close along the edge of the Wolfswood, where the trees pressed thick enough on either side to swallow whatever light the overcast afternoon still offered. Jon felt it before he saw it, Ghost's ears pinning flat, the direwolf's pace slowing to a stalking crawl at the tree line's edge, a low warning rumble building in his chest that Jon had learned, over months of riding and hunting and standing watch together, never once to ignore. "Sam." Jon's voice dropped low, urgent. "Off the road. Now." They'd barely cleared the open ground when the first arrow hissed past where Jon's head had been a heartbeat before, burying itself with a soft thud into the trunk of an old ash tree. Sam let out a strangled sound and dove for cover behind a fallen log with a speed that surprised them both, dragging his horse's reins with him, and Jon was already off his own mount, sword bare, moving low and fast toward the tree line where the shot had come from rather than away from it. The last thing any ambusher expected from their target, and exactly the thing 6 months of Alizer Thorne's brutal instruction had drilled into him as the only sane response to an arrow you couldn't outrun. 4 of them he counted in the space of a few heartbeats, 1 with the bow, already knocking a second arrow, and 3 more breaking from cover with blades drawn, moving in a pattern too disciplined to be simple highwaymen. Professional, paid, and leading them, a lean, gray-bearded man in a dented breastplate who carried himself with the particular economy of a knight who'd spent real years on real battlefields rather than tourney grounds. Jon Snow. The lead man said his name like he was tasting something bitter and satisfying at once. "Sir Denys Mallow. You'll forgive me if I don't bow. My father died on the Trident fighting for a dragon queen your father's rebellion burned out of the world, and I've waited 19 years for a Stark to bleed for that. The gold I'm being paid for this is almost beside the point." "Then you're a fool twice over," Jon said, circling, keeping the fallen log between himself and the archer's clean line of sight. "Fighting a war that ended before I was born, for a woman who will forget your name the moment you're no longer useful to her. Careful talk for a bastard about to die in the mud." Mallow's blade came up, and the 3 men flanking him spread wide, trying to circle around the log toward Sam's hiding place, and Jon understood with the particular clarity that came in moments like this exactly what they intended: pin him at the front, flank around to remove the boy protecting the second set of papers, finish them both before either could scream loud enough to draw help from the road. He didn't wait for them to finish spreading. He closed the distance on Mallow directly, fast and low, forcing the older knight to commit to the fight in front of him rather than direct the flanking maneuver from a safe distance. And their blades met with a shock that ran up through Jon's arm hard enough to numb his fingers for a heartbeat. Mallow was good, better than Osric Payne had been, seasoned by real wars rather than tourney posturing, and for several exchanges he pressed Jon back with a series of hard, disciplined strikes that would have ended a lesser swordsman's fight in the first 10 seconds. But Jon had spent 6 months absorbing exactly this kind of pressure from a man who'd wanted him broken, and he'd learned, the hard way, over and over, that surviving a stronger opponent meant never trying to match their strength directly. He gave ground deliberately, letting Mallow's momentum carry him forward past the log's edge. And when the older knight's next strike came in high and committed, Jon dropped low instead of parrying, driving his shoulder into Mallow's exposed ribs, and using the man's own forward momentum to send him staggering off balance into the very undergrowth his men were trying to flank through. The archer's second arrow went wide, clipping bark rather than flesh, and then Ghost was among them, a white shape breaking from the tree line with a speed that turned two of the flanking swordsmen's confident advance into a scrambling, desperate retreat, one of them screaming as the direwolf's jaws closed on his sword arm and dragged him bodily off his feet. "Sam, the bow!" Jon shouted and heard, a heartbeat later, the distinctive crack of a crossbow bolt. Sam had carried the small weapon since the wall, useless in his own hands for anything requiring speed or subtlety, but devastatingly effective at close range against a man who'd forgotten in the chaos that the fat boy hiding behind the log might be armed at all. The archer went down with a bolt through his shoulder, his own weapon clattering uselessly into the mud. Mallow recovered his footing fast, faster than Jon expected of a man his age, and came at him again with a fury that had abandoned all its earlier discipline, driven now by something rawer, the desperate fury of a man who'd waited 19 years for this moment and felt it slipping away from him with every heartbeat. Jon met the wild swing with a parry that turned Mallow's blade wide, stepped in close enough to smell the man's sweat and old leather, and drove the pommel of his sword hard into Mallow's temple. The older knight went down and didn't get back up. The last swordsman, seeing his companions broken in the space of perhaps 30 seconds, one bleeding out under a direwolf's weight, one shot through the shoulder, and his leader unconscious in the mud, made the only sane choice left to him and ran, crashing back through the undergrowth toward whatever horses they'd left tethered further up the road. And Jon let him go rather than chase him into unfamiliar woods with darkness coming on. Sam emerged from behind the log shaking, the crossbow still gripped tight in both hands, staring at the fallen archer with an expression somewhere between horror and disbelief that he'd actually managed to hit anything at all. "I hit him," he said, voice unsteady. "Jon, I actually hit him." "You did." Jon crossed to check Mallow's pulse, steady if faint, the man merely unconscious rather than dead, and then straightened, breathing hard, surveying the small, brutal wreckage of the ambush with the same calm, methodical attention he'd have given a training exercise back at Castle Black. "Good work. Better than good. Who sends 4 trained killers after 2 travelers on the King's Road?" Sam's voice had steadied slightly, though his hands still trembled around the crossbow's stock. "This wasn't luck, Jon. Someone knew we were coming this way." Jon looked down at Mallow's unconscious face, weathered and scarred by old grief 19 years deep, and thought of Varys' warning, which he had not yet received, would not receive for another full day, the little bird still working its way north along a slower route than the ambush itself had traveled, and felt the shape of the danger settle more clearly into focus than it had before. "Someone in that city knows I'm carrying this south," he said. "Which means we're not safe on open roads anymore, and we won't be again until this is finished, one way or another." He began going through Mallow's pockets, methodical, searching for anything that might name whoever had sent him. "We move faster from here and we're more careful about which roads we take. And Sam," he looked up and something steady and grateful passed between them, "you did well today, better than well, I mean that." Sam managed a shaky smile, still holding the crossbow like it might go off again on its own. "I'd rather not do it again any time soon if it's all the same to you." "It won't be up to us," Jon said grimly, and helped him bind the wounded archer's shoulder well enough that the man wouldn't bleed out on the roadside. Because even now, even with steel already drawn against him twice over in the space of half a year. Some part of Jon Snow could not quite bring himself to leave a defeated enemy to die slowly and alone in the mud. They reached the edge of the Wolfswood proper 2 days later, the towers of Winterfell finally visible in the gray distance, and found the castle already humming with the particular grim energy of a house preparing for war, banners being counted, swords being sharpened, riders coming and going from the gates at all hours with news that never seemed to be good news anymore. Robb Stark met them in the yard himself, and the look on his face when he recognized his half-brother, road-worn, bloodied at the knuckles, a dire wolf at his side and a boy from the wall trailing exhausted behind him, carried more relief and more fear in equal measure than Jon had ever seen on his brother's face before. "Jon," Robb's voice cracked just slightly on the single word. "Gods, Jon, we thought Mother had word you'd left the watch. No one knew why, no one knew where you'd gone." He stopped himself, visibly gathering the scattered pieces of whatever composure a young lord trying to hold a war together still had left to spare. "Father's alive. That's the only mercy in any of it. But there's word from the city. They're saying he'll be tried publicly, before the whole court within the fortnight. And I don't know what that trial's going to end with, Jon, whatever we do from here." Jon looked at his brother's exhausted, frightened face, and then past him, to the yard full of northern men preparing for a war that might not need to happen at all, if only the truth reached the right ears in time, and felt, settling into his chest alongside the grief and the urgency, the same clean, focused certainty he'd felt in Mormont's solar the night everything finally began to move. "I know exactly how to end it," he said. "But we don't have much time, Robb, and I need you to trust me with everything I'm about to tell you, because it's going to sound impossible, and every word of it is true." Chapter 6. What the realm remembers. Robb didn't sit down once through the whole of it. He paced the length of the solar with his hands laced behind his back, the firelight throwing his shadow long and restless across the stone, while Jon laid out everything: the letter, the genealogical record, the testimony, the letters between Cersei and Jaime that Jon had finally, reluctantly, let his brother read in full. When Robb finished the last page, he didn't speak for a long moment. He simply stood there, staring down at Cersei Lannister's own handwriting, his jaw working like a man trying to swallow something too large for his throat. "She's been laughing at us," he said finally, very quietly. "The whole realm, every lord who bent the knee to Robert's line, every man who died on the trident so a Baratheon king could sit that throne. She's been laughing at every one of us for 15 years. She's been surviving," Jon said. "That's not the same as laughing, though I don't doubt she's found it useful to let people underestimate her while she did it. But it doesn't matter what she felt while she did it, Robb. What matters is what we do with the truth now that we have it." "What we do," Robb rounded on him, and for a moment the exhaustion and grief and fury of the last weeks finally broke fully to the surface. "Father's in a cell with a broken leg. They're saying he'll stand trial for treason before the whole court, and everyone knows what that trial's going to end with, whatever pretty words they dress it in. I have half the North already mustered in this yard, Jon, 10,000 men who'll follow me south the moment I give the word, and you're telling me the answer is a piece of paper. I'm telling you the answer is a war you can't win fast enough to save him, if it comes to that." Jon's voice stayed level, deliberately so, because he understood exactly how close his brother stood to breaking in a direction that would cost them everything. "You march 10,000 men south, Robb, and it takes weeks. Weeks Father doesn't have if the trial happens as fast as the Ravens are saying. And even if you arrive in time, what then? You lay siege to King's Landing. You burn a city of 500,000 people to save one man and start a war that costs thousands more lives on both sides when the truth I'm holding could end this before a single sword needs to be drawn. You don't know it'll work." "No," Jon admitted. I don't. But I know marching an army south guarantees a war either way, whether the truth comes out or not, because Cersei Lannister will see 10,000 Northmen coming and she'll assume the worst regardless of what you intend, and she'll act accordingly, against father, against Sansa, against anyone she can reach before your army ever gets close enough to matter. He stepped closer, meeting his brother's eyes directly. Send your host south, Robb. I'm not telling you not to. The realm needs to see the North isn't going to sit quiet while father's charged with a lie, and that pressure alone might buy time we wouldn't have otherwise. But let the host be the shield, not the sword. Let me be the one who actually ends this. You, alone. Not alone, Sam's with me, and I'll take whoever you can spare who can ride fast and fight quiet, 6 men at most, no banners, no warning ahead of us. We move faster than any army possibly could, and we get inside that city before the trial, and I put this. He tapped the papers on the table between them, into enough hands that no one can bury it again, however hard they try. Catelyn Stark, who had stood silent by the door through the whole exchange, her face carved from something colder and harder than Jon had ever seen it, finally spoke. You would trust a boy of 19 to walk into the heart of the Lannisters' own city and unmake a queen, rather than trust an army of 10,000 men. Jon turned to face her, and found, for the first time in his life, that her cold assessment didn't sting the way it once might have. I'd trust the boy who's already killed 2 men sent specifically to stop him from doing exactly this, my lady. I'd trust the boy who's carried this secret for 6 months without a single misstep, while an army marching south would announce itself from 50 miles out and give every enemy in that city weeks to prepare a response. He looked back to Robb. I'm not asking permission, Robb. I came here because you needed to know the truth before you did anything else, and because I'd rather ride south with your blessing than without it. But I'm going regardless of what either of you decides tonight. Something in Robb's face shifted then, the fury banking down into something more measured, more like the young lord who would need to hold a war together in the months ahead rather than simply the brother grieving a father he might yet lose. You've changed, he said quietly, since the wall. You don't ask anymore. You just tell people what you're going to do and dare them to argue. I've had 6 months to learn that asking gets people killed, Jon said. I'd rather act and be wrong than wait and be too late. Robb was quiet a long moment, and then he crossed to the table and picked up the letter Jon Arryn had written, reading it through one final time with an expression that had gone very still. Take Grey Wind's litter brother in temperament, if not in size. Torrhen Little's a hard man and quiet. He'll ride with you and not ask questions he doesn't need answered. And take Hally's Malin too. He knows the roads south of the Trident better than any man in this castle. He set the letter down, and something in the gesture felt final, a decision fully made. I'll march the host south 3 days behind you, slow enough that word of it reaches King's Landing before we arrive, fast enough that it means something once it does. If your plan fails, Jon, if you're caught, if the truth doesn't move fast enough to save him, I want you to understand I will burn that city to ash to get father back. I need you to understand that before you go, so you know exactly what you're riding ahead of. I understand it. Jon gripped his brother's forearm, hard, the closest thing to an embrace either of them had ever been comfortable with. I don't intend to fail. They reached the outskirts of King's Landing 11 days later, 6 riders and a direwolf who had learned, over the long weeks south, to move like a shadow through open country when the situation demanded it. And Jon felt the weight of the city settle over him the moment its walls came into view, vast, filthy, teeming with more people than he'd seen in his entire life gathered in one place, the stink of it reaching them a full mile before the gates did. They didn't ride in through the main gate. Torrhen Little, true to Robb's word, had spent enough years as a smuggler in his youth. a fact he mentioned only once, and only when directly useful, to know a merchant's entrance along the river where a modest bribe and an unremarkable story bought passage without questions. Jon left Ghost outside the walls entirely, in the scrub along the riverbank with Hallie's Malin to watch over him, because a direwolf walking the streets of King's Landing would draw exactly the kind of attention 6 riders trying to be invisible could not afford. "I don't like leaving him," Jon admitted, crouched beside the direwolf in the gathering dusk, scratching behind his ears while Ghost regarded him with those unsettling red eyes that had never once, in all the months since Jon first found him orphaned in the snow, failed to seem like they understood far more than a wolf's eyes should. "He'll be safer here than in there," Sam said, not unkindly. "And will be safer without every guardsman in the city wondering why a bastard from the walls got a direwolf trotting along beside him." Jon nodded and left, and told himself the ache in his chest at Ghost's low, mournful sound behind him was simply the ordinary weight of the moment, nothing more. The trial, or whatever they were calling it now, the word had shifted twice in the last messages reaching them on the road, from trial to confession to something Jon suspected was closer to the truth of it. A carefully staged performance meant to end with Ned Stark disgracing himself publicly enough that no honest man would ever rally behind whatever he tried to say before his arrest, had been set for the steps of the great sept of Baelor, 2 days hence, timed, Jon suspected, to coincide with some feast day that would guarantee the largest possible crowd to witness his father's public humiliation. 2 days. It was tighter than Jon liked, but it was enough, if everything else fell into place the way he needed it to. He found the house Varys' warning had come from, a modest, unremarkable building 3 streets back from the Street of Silk, the kind of place that drew no attention because it had been built specifically to draw none, and knocked in the pattern Eamon had suggested, 3 short raps and a pause and 2 more, a signal so old and so obscure that Jon had half expected it to mean nothing at all to anyone still living. The door opened on a plump, soft-faced man Jon recognized from descriptions alone, though nothing in those descriptions had prepared him for how utterly unremarkable Varys looked in person, how easily he could have passed for any minor merchant or minor lord steward in any street in the city. "Jon Snow," Varys said, and there was genuine surprise in his voice, quickly smoothed over. "I confess I did not expect you to arrive quite so quickly, nor quite so directly. Most men in your position would have gone to ground the moment they entered the city, rather than knocking on the door of a man they've never met, using a signal I gave your Meister friend on a whim I half regretted the moment the bird left my hand. You sent a warning north, about an ambush. I did. It seems it arrived too late to prevent whatever happened, given the state of you." Varys' eyes moved over Jon's face, taking in the fading bruises, the road-worn cloak, with the particular thoroughness of a man cataloging every detail for later use. "You survived it regardless. I confess I'm not entirely surprised. Why send the warning at all? You don't know me. You've no reason to help a bastard boy from the wall against a queen who could make your life very difficult if she learned you'd crossed her." Varys smiled, soft and unreadable. "I serve the realm, Jon Snow, whatever else people believe of me, and a realm built on a lie this large, allowed to stand unchallenged for another generation, serves no one well in the end, not the small folk who'll bleed for a false king's wars, not the lords who'll die contesting a throne with no legitimate heir sitting it, not even the spider who has to live in whatever wreckage that eventually produces." He stepped back from the door, gesturing Jon inside with the particular economy of a man who never wasted a movement. "I did not send that warning because I love you, or trust you, or even fully believe yet that whatever you're carrying will do more good than harm once it's spoken aloud. I sent it because I have learned across 30 years in this city that chaos handled badly costs everyone dearly, and I would rather see this particular chaos handled well than watch it explode into something none of us can control." Jon studied him a long moment, weighing the offer against everything Aemon had warned him about trusting no one at court who hadn't proven themselves first. "What do you want in exchange for helping me?" "Direct. I appreciate that in a man, it's rarer than you'd think in this city." Varys' smile widened slightly. "I want the realm to survive whatever comes of this, Jon Snow, in a shape that doesn't tear itself apart over the wreckage of a false succession. That is the whole of my price, and I suspect it's a price you were already prepared to pay before you ever knocked on my door. Beyond that, I want it known, quietly, that when the moment came, I chose to help rather than simply watch. That currency may matter to me later in ways I don't yet fully understand myself. And if I refuse to give you that, then I've still gained something," Varys said simply. "The knowledge of exactly how far you're willing to go and exactly how you think, which is worth a great deal to a man in my position regardless of how tonight's conversation ends." He gestured to a chair. "Sit, Jon Snow. Tell me exactly what you intend to do in 2 days' time, and let me tell you exactly why most of it won't work the way you're imagining, and precisely what will." The plan Varys sketched over the following hours was simpler than Jon had expected, and more dangerous. Not a secret infiltration through hidden passages, which Varys dismissed almost immediately as too easily discovered and too easily blamed on him personally if it went wrong, but something bolder, something that relied entirely on the one advantage Jon actually possessed that no amount of careful scheming could replicate. "You are Eddard Stark's son," Varys said. "Whatever the circumstances of your birth, that fact alone earns you the right to stand before that crowd and speak for your father, the way any son might. No one will stop a boy claiming that right at the base of those steps, not without cause, and not in front of every lord and small folk gathered to watch. The moment you're stopped by force, in public, in front of that many witnesses, you've already won half the argument, because a queen who silences a grieving son by force looks exactly as guilty as the truth says she is. And the proof itself, you'll need it read aloud by someone the crowd trusts more than they trust a Stark bastard's word alone, however compelling that word might be." Varys' eyes had gone distant, calculating. Grand Maester Pycelle authored those notes on Baratheon bloodlines. If he's forced to confirm his own hand in front of witnesses, with no time prepared to deny it or twist it into something safer, that carries weight no amount of Stark testimony alone could match, because it comes from inside the very institution the crown relies on to validate its own legitimacy. He'll lie. He may try, but a man cornered publicly, with his own handwriting held up before a crowd of lords who will remember every word he says for the rest of their lives, rarely lies as smoothly as he'd like to think he will. Fear does strange things to careful men, Jon Snow. I have watched it happen more times than I can count. Varys steepled his fingers. As for the letters between the queen and her brother, those I would not read aloud myself if I were you. Let a septon do it. The faith carries a particular weight in matters of legitimacy, and sin that even the most cynical lord in that crowd will find difficult to dismiss outright. And there is a young septon attached to Baelor's sept itself, a man named Torbert, whose loyalty to the faith's honesty runs deeper than his loyalty to whichever crown currently sits the throne. I can arrange for him to be standing close enough to intervene, if the moment calls for it. You've thought about this a great deal, for a man who claims he only just learned I was in the city. Varys' smile turned faintly rueful. I have thought about the shape of this problem for months, Jon Snow, ever since a rider left this city on a debt Arryn no one could quite explain. I did not know, until tonight, that the solution would arrive at my door wearing a black cloak and carrying a direwolf's loyalty rather than an army's. But a careful man prepares for possibilities long before they knock, and I have had a great deal of practice at exactly that particular patience. The morning of the confession broke clear and cold, the kind of bright, fall spring day that seemed almost cruelly indifferent to what was about to happen beneath it. The steps of the great Sept of Baelor had filled since before dawn with a crowd that stretched back through the plaza and into the surrounding streets, small folk packed shoulder to shoulder with lesser lords and merchants, all of them drawn by the particular grim spectacle of watching a once mighty man brought low. Jon stood near the front of that crowd, hooded, unremarkable, Sam beside him doing his best impression of a nervous merchant's clerk, while up on the platform before the Sept's great doors, a small dais had been arranged with Joffrey seated at its center in robes too grand for a boy who'd barely had time to grow into his crown, flanked by Cersei on one side and the gleaming white shapes of the Kingsguard on the other. Sansa stood nearby, pale and trembling, her hands clasped tight enough to whiten her knuckles, and beside her, brought up in chains with his legs splinted and his face gaunt from weeks in a cell, stood Ned Stark. Jon's chest tightened at the sight of him. His father, always so solid and unbending in Jon's memory, reduced now to something gaunt and gray, leaning heavily on a length of wood someone had given him in place of a proper crutch. But the eyes, when they finally scanned the crowd in a slow, weary arc, were still Ned Stark's eyes, still sharp despite everything, and Jon felt a fierce, sudden gratitude that his father had survived this long at all. Grand Maester Pycelle stood near the edge of the dais, reading from a scroll in a voice pitched to carry, listing the charges, treason, conspiracy against the crown, plotting to seize the Iron Throne for himself. And Jon felt his jaw tighten at every word of it, at how easily a lie could be dressed in official language and read aloud as though it were simply fact. Ned's confession, when it came, was brief and clearly rehearsed, the words of a man who had bargained his honor for his daughter's safety, and found the cost of that bargain sitting like ash in his mouth. "I plotted to steal the throne for myself," he said, his voice carrying across the plaza with a flatness that suggested every syllable cost him something. "Robert was not my king and no true friend, and I sought his throne through treachery." "Liar," Jon heard himself say, quiet at first, and then louder, the word tearing free of him before he'd fully decided to speak it at all. He was moving before he'd finished the thought, pushing through the crowd toward the base of the steps, Sam scrambling after him with the wrapped bundle of papers clutched tight against his chest. "That man never lied a day in his life that I've ever known of," Jon called out louder now, loud enough that heads across the nearest quarter of the crowd began turning. "And he's not lying today either. He's confessing to save his daughter's life, which is the only crime Ned Stark has ever truly committed, being a father who'd rather lie about himself than see his children harmed." The Kingsguard on the platform stirred, and Joffrey's face, petulant and confused, turned toward the disturbance with the particular irritation of a boy unused to interruption. "Who is that? Seize him." "I'm his son," Jon shouted, and the crowd's murmur swelled into something louder, a rippling wave of curiosity and confusion spreading outward as men craned to see the hooded figure who dared interrupt a royal proceeding. "Jon Snow, of Winterfell, bastard son of Ned Stark, and I've ridden 500 miles to tell every soul in this plaza that the crime he's confessing to is a lie built to hide a far greater one." Two gold cloaks moved to intercept him at the base of the steps, hands reaching for his arms, and Jon didn't resist so much as redirect. A hard twist that broke one man's grip entirely and sent him stumbling, a shoulder into the second that knocked him back into the crowd, movements too fast and too clean for the untrained guardsmen to properly counter. He'd spent 6 months absorbing exactly this kind of pressure from Alliser Thorne, learning to move through resistance rather than simply against it. And it showed now in a way that made the watching crowd gasp and surge forward, eager for whatever spectacle was about to unfold. "Kill him," Cersei's voice cut across the platform, cold and immediate. But Sir Barristan Selmy, old, silver-haired, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard who had served 3 kings with an honor that had never once bent to convenience, raised a hand before the nearest of his sworn brothers could move. "He's an unarmed boy claiming to be Lord Stark's son, in front of half this city, your grace," Selmy said, his voice carrying its own quiet authority. "Cutting him down before he's spoken his piece will look, to every man watching, exactly like fear of what he might say. I'd advise letting him speak, and letting the crowd judge the truth of it for themselves." Cersei's face, for just a moment, showed something raw and furious before smoothing back into practiced composure, and Jon understood, watching that flicker, exactly how close he'd already come to being right about everything. He climbed the last few steps himself, unhindered now, Sam close behind him with the papers, and stood before the dais with his hood finally thrown back, meeting his father's eyes for one long, wordless moment that carried more between them than any speech could have managed. "My father took the handship because a friend he loved asked him to," Jon said, turning to face the crowd, his voice pitched now with the same steady certainty he'd used facing down Osric Payne in the dark, facing down Sir Denys Mallow on the Kingsroad, a voice that had learned, across the last 6 months, exactly how much weight it could carry without breaking. He came to this city to serve honestly, and he found in the course of that service a truth that the man who died before him, Jon Arryn, the last true hand of this kingdom, had already discovered and died for uncovering. That truth is this: the children sitting on that dais beside the Queen are not King Robert's children at all. They never were. And the man kneeling in chains before you, confessing to treason he never committed, is being silenced because he refused to pretend otherwise. The crowd's murmur had grown into something closer to a roar now, disbelief and shock rippling outward through the plaza in waves, and Joffrey's face had gone pale and furious, his mouth working around words that wouldn't quite come. "This is madness," Cersei called out, her voice cutting sharp across the noise. "A bastard's desperate lie to save his father's neck, nothing more. Guards, remove him." "I have proof," Jon said, and the single word cut through the crowd's noise with a force that silenced half of it outright. He nodded to Sam, who stepped forward, hands trembling slightly as he unwrapped the bundle he'd carried the whole 500 miles south, and produced first the genealogical record, holding it high enough for the nearest Rose to see the old official seal upon its cover. "House Baratheon's true coloring runs black-haired and blue-eyed across 4 generations without fail," Jon said, "a fact recorded by the Citadel itself in this very book. Look at the boy on that dais. Golden hair, green eyes, not a trace of his supposed father's blood in him at all, and the same is true of his sister and brother both." He turned toward Pycelle, who had gone very still near the edge of the dais, his face waxen. Grand Maester Pycelle wrote notes confirming exactly this impossibility, months ago, for Jon Arryn himself. "I have those notes here, in his own hand. Will you deny writing them, Grand Maester, in front of every lord and small folk gathered to hear you say so?" Pycelle's mouth opened and closed, and no sound came out at all for a long, damning moment. And that silence, more than any confession could have, told the crowd everything it needed to know. "He wrote them," Jon said into the silence, "because he suspected the truth himself, and was too careful a man or too frightened a man to speak it aloud until someone else forced the matter into the light. I am forcing it now." He turned back to the crowd, and drew, finally, the last and most damning pieces from beneath his own cloak, the letters, worn now from the long road south, but still entirely legible, still carrying Cersei Lannister's own unmistakable hand. "These are letters between the Queen and her brother, Sir Jaime Lannister," Jon said. "I will not read the whole of them aloud, because there are children in this crowd, and what they contain is not fit for young ears. But I will have a man of the faith confirm what they say, because I trust the small folk of this city to believe a septon's honest testimony before they'll believe a bastard's word alone." The young septon Varys had promised, Torbert, thin and earnest, and visibly terrified by the weight of what he'd agreed to do, stepped forward from where he'd been waiting near the base of the steps, and took the letters from Jon's hand with fingers that shook only slightly. He read through the first one in silence, his face going progressively paler with every line, and when he finally looked up, his voice cracked with the effort of what he had to say. "These letters," he said, "describe an intimacy between the Queen and her own brother that no septon of the faith could call anything but sin, sustained across many years, and they speak, plainly in the Queen's own hand, of children born from that sin and passed off as another man's." He crossed himself, visibly shaken. "I would stake my own soul that this is her handwriting. I have seen royal correspondence before. In my duties at this September I know her seal, and I know her hand, and this is both." The plaza had gone utterly, terribly silent, 5,000 people holding a single collective breath, and into that silence, Cersei Lannister's voice rose, sharp and desperate in a way Jon had never expected to hear from her. "Forgeries," she said, but the word came out wrong, too fast, too high, missing entirely the cold control that had carried her through every crisis of the last 15 years. "A bastard's forgery built to save his traitor father, mother." Joffrey's voice, small and confused and suddenly, terribly young, cut through her denial. "Mother, is it true?" Cersei turned to her son, and something in her face broke open in that moment. Not guilt exactly, but a raw, desperate love utterly unmasked in front of 5,000 strangers. And Jon watched her make, in the space of a single heartbeat, the choice that would define the rest of whatever life she had left to live. "You are my son," she said, fierce and low, ignoring the crowd entirely now, ignoring the collapsing architecture of everything she'd built to protect exactly this moment from ever happening. "Whatever else is true, you are my son, and I have loved you since before you drew your first breath, and nothing this bastard boy says changes that." "But am I the king?" Joffrey's voice cracked entirely now, 13 years old and utterly out of his depth, the cruelty that had marked him since birth momentarily washed away by simple, childish fear. "Mother, tell me I'm the king." Cersei had no answer for that, and her silence, more devastating than any confession, finished what Jon's proof had started. Sir Barristan Selmy moved first, crossing the platform with the deliberate authority of a man who had served honor his whole life, and had finally, after 15 years of quiet compromise, found a moment worth acting on without hesitation. He knelt before Ned Stark and with a single stroke of his own dagger, cut the chains binding his wrists. Lord Stark's confession was extracted under duress to save his daughter's life, from a man who has never in his life been anything but honest, Selmy said, his voice carrying across the stunned plaza. "I will not stand Kingsguard to a boy whose claim has just been shattered in front of 5,000 witnesses. Whatever comes of this day, it will not be built on my continued silence." Chaos followed, real chaos, sudden and sprawling, gold cloaks uncertain whose orders to follow, lords in the crowd shouting questions and accusations in every direction, Cersei backing toward the Sept's great doors with Tommen and Miachella gathered close against her, her face gone hard and cold again now that the raw moment of exposure had passed, calculating already, Jon could see, exactly how much of this could still be salvaged and how much simply had to be abandoned. "Guards!" She called one final, desperate command. "Take the Stark bastard," but no one moved to obey her. The gold cloaks nearest the dais had already begun, one by one, to lower their spears, watching a queen whose authority had just publicly disintegrated with the particular wary uncertainty of men who no longer knew whose orders would still matter tomorrow. And in that uncertain silence, Jon crossed the platform himself, past Pycelle's frozen, ashen face, past the stunned remnants of the Kingsguard, and knelt before his father, helping him rise with careful, steady hands. "Jon." Ned's voice was rough, disbelieving, his eyes searching his son's face as though checking, over and over, that this wasn't some fevered dream born of weeks in a cell. "How?" "Jon Arryn sent it to me," Jon said quietly, just for his father to hear, amid the roaring chaos of the plaza around them. "Before he died. He didn't trust anyone else with it, not even you, because he was afraid it would get you killed too soon to matter. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. I didn't know how, without risking exactly what almost happened to you regardless." Ned's hand came up, gripping Jon's shoulder with a strength that seemed impossible for a man who'd spent weeks starving in a cell, and something in his weathered, exhausted face broke open into an expression Jon had rarely seen there before, not simply relief, but something closer to awe. "You did this," Ned said. "Alone. You carried this the whole time, and you never once told me, and you still found a way to save my life with it, the moment it mattered most." His voice caught. "I don't know whether to be furious with you for the risk you took, or prouder of you than I've ever been of anything in my life." "You can be both," Jon said, and something in the exhaustion and the terror and the sheer relief of the moment finally cracked through the composure he'd carried the whole way south, and he found himself absurdly, almost laughing. "I'd understand either way." The days that followed were chaos of a different kind, political chaos, careful and dangerous in its own right. As the small council scrambled to reconstitute itself around a throne that suddenly had no legitimate occupant at all, Cersei fled the Red Keep that same night with Tommen and Miecella, and a small retinue of loyal household guard, making for Casterly Rock and whatever protection her father's gold and swords could still offer her. And no one moved to stop her, not Selmy, not the remaining Kingsguard, not even Ned Stark himself, who had argued, over the objections of half the small council, that hunting down a mother fleeing with her children served no purpose beyond cruelty, whatever her crimes. She poisoned Jon Arryn, Renly Baratheon had pointed out, arriving from his own city holdings within days of the news reaching him, his face still pale with shock at everything he'd missed. She likely arranged Robert's death too, whatever the boar's tusks actually did to finish the job. That's not a woman who deserves mercy, Lord Stark. No, Ned agreed. But her children didn't choose their birth, any more than Jon chose his, and I'll not see two innocent children hunted across the realm for a sin their mother committed before either of them could speak a word. Let her go. Let Casterly Rock deal with whatever she brings home to her father's door. We have a realm to steady, and vengeance can wait for better men than me to decide it's necessary. The small council settled in the end on the only claimant whose blood ran true, and whose claim no one could reasonably dispute, Stannis Baratheon, summoned from Dragonstone with a speed that surprised everyone who'd assumed the stern, humorless lord would take weeks to even respond to the summons, arriving instead within a fortnight with a fleet at his back, and an expression that suggested he'd been waiting his entire life for exactly this moment to finally, belatedly arrive. He did not thank Jon directly. Stannis Baratheon was not, by any account Jon had ever heard, a man given easily to gratitude, but he studied him a long while. In the first private audience the new king granted after his coronation, with an expression that carried its own particular weight. "You could have kept this quiet," Stannis said. "Used it for leverage instead, sold it to whichever claimant offered you the most in exchange. Many men in your position would have." "I didn't take it to profit from it," Jon said. "I took it because Jon Arryn trusted me with it, and because letting a lie sit that throne would have cost this realm more than I was willing to let it cost. A bastard's answer. Something almost like respect flickered across Stannis' stern face. I do not forget debts, Snow, whatever else people say of me. You'll find, if you ever need it, that this crown remembers exactly what it owes you. Jon found Ghost waiting for him outside the city walls 3 days later, exactly where he'd left him, and the direwolf's joy at seeing him again was loud and unrestrained enough to draw stares from the merchants passing along the riverbank road. He buried his hands in the thick white fur and let himself, for just a moment, simply feel the relief of it. His father alive, the truth spoken, the weight he'd carried alone for 6 months finally shared with a realm that would have to reckon with it now, whatever came next. His father found him there at dusk, walking slower than he once had, leaning on a proper crutch now rather than the makeshift length of wood, but walking nonetheless, his face carrying the particular exhausted peace of a man who had come far closer to losing everything than he'd ever expected to, and had somehow, impossibly, come out the other side of it. Winterfell will want you home, Ned said, settling carefully onto a fallen log beside where Jon sat with Ghost's head heavy across his lap. Robb's already sent word he's turning the host back north, now that there's no war left to fight down here. Your sisters will want to see you. Sansa most of all, I think. She's spoken of little else since the sept but the brother who rode out of a crowd to save our whole family. I'm not sure I know how to be that exactly. The brother who saved everyone. Jon's voice was quiet, uncertain in a way that surprised even him, after everything. I spent my whole life being told what I wasn't allowed to be. I don't quite know what I'm allowed to be now. You're allowed to be whatever you've already proven yourself to be, Jon. Ned's voice carried a gravity Jon had rarely heard from him, even in the most serious conversations of his childhood. A man who held a truth that could have broken him 100 different ways, and instead used it to save the people he loved. A man good kings will remember owing a debt to, for the rest of his life, and likely well beyond it. I don't think the name Snow is going to mean quite what it used to mean after this. I don't think it can. Jon looked out over the darkening river, the lights of King's Landing beginning to flicker to life behind them, and thought of everything the last 6 months had cost and given him in equal, tangled measure. A father nearly lost and finally, truly known. A brotherhood with Sam forged in genuine danger rather than convenient friendship. A confidence in himself that no amount of Alliser Thorne's cruelty or Catelyn Stark's cold distance had ever managed to take root before now. There's still a war coming, he said finally. Not this one, something else. I felt it, standing the wall those months, something in the deep cold that no one south of it has bothered to think about in 100 years. I don't think this ends the danger, Father. I think it just cleared away one lie so we could see the real one still waiting. Ned was quiet a long moment, watching his son's face in the fading light, and something in his expression suggested he'd already begun, in the privacy of his own careful mind, to weigh exactly that possibility. Then we'll face it, he said simply. The same way we faced this one, together and honestly and without flinching from whatever it costs us to see it through. He reached out and gripped Jon's shoulder, the same gesture he'd offered on the sept steps, but steadier now, surer. You are not just my bastard son anymore, Jon. Whatever the law calls you, whatever some septon's blessing did or didn't say over your mother's bed, you are the man who saved this family, and saved this realm from a lie that would have torn it apart eventually regardless. I intend to make certain the whole of the North knows it, and the whole of the South besides, whatever it costs either of us to say it plainly. Behind them, the city that had nearly killed his father and had instead, through 6 months of careful, deliberate courage, been forced to reckon with a truth it desperately hadn't wanted to face, settled into the ordinary business of a new night beginning, merchants closing their stalls, watchmen lighting their lanterns, a realm slowly, uncertainly finding its footing again after the ground beneath it had shifted more violently than most of its people would ever fully understand. Jon Snow sat with his father and his direwolf on the riverbank as the stars came out overhead, and felt, for the first time since a rider had handed him a locked chest in a cold and forgotten castle at the edge of the world, something like peace, not the end of the fight, because he understood now, with a clarity Jon Arryn's own careful nature had taught him to trust, that greater fights than this one were still gathering somewhere beyond the wall's white shadow. But peace enough for tonight, to simply sit beside a father he'd nearly lost and know, without any doubt left in him at all, exactly what kind of man he had chosen to become.